India has launched a war against China. And it's not a war that will be fought on the battlefield. Rather, it's a war that will be fought economically. India has started emerging as the next great powerhouse of Asia in order to counter China's aggression. New Delhi has now positioned itself as an alternative for companies that are getting tired of being used like a pawn in the CCP's grand ambition towards taking over the world. Companies like Apple are already moving to India to set up for a world after China. India has slowly launched its own global projects to counteract China's growing influence from the Belt and Road Initiative. Prime Minister Modi has started India's own lending program for its neighbors in order to stop China from gaining influence by using its debt trap diplomacy. So today, let's go over how India became China's greatest threat.
The head of MI6 last year accused China of using debt traps to gain leverage over countries.
Sri Lanka sought China's financial help. The country took loans worth $45 billion from various countries, including more than $8 billion from China.
An agreement for a $1 billion credit line from India.
The fast patrol vessel will be the fourth ship to be gifted by India to Seychelles.
Pakistan is all set to receive a $700 million loan from China to help it shore its foreign exchange reserves, which are at a 10-year low.
This video took a lot of effort. Recently, my videos have been getting age restricted, which severely hurts their reach with the algorithm, and doesn't really make that much sense. So if you guys can please take a second and hit the like button below, it will help me out a lot. Thank you. So let's start from the beginning. Something that might surprise most of you is the fact that historically, India and China were strong allies and friendly economic partners. The Silk Road linked the cities of Xi'an in China and Pataliputra in India. Trade on the tea and horse road, as the Chinese called it, was a significant factor in the growth of Chinese and Indian civilizations. Coming into modern history, both civilizations had their hands full with their colonizers, as India had the British and China had the Japanese. That didn't stop their leaders from supporting each other. Even under British rule, Indian leaders publicly showed their support for China's struggles against the Japanese. In 1939, future Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, visited China as an honored guest of the government. Both countries actually helped each other in their battles. India helped China against the Japanese and Western imperialism, and in return, China supported India's independence movement against the British. Then, in 1947, India gained its independence from the British Empire. And 2 years later, in 1949, the People's Republic of China, or PRC, came into power in China. This is where the relationship could have soured. Up to this point, Indian leaders had been friendly with the ROC, the Republic of China. When Mao Zedong's PRC came into power, the ROC fled mainland China and took over Taiwan. I'm sure you guys are already familiar with the China-Taiwan issue, so I won't go into it right now. But good relations between the two nations continued, even under new leadership. In fact, India was one of the first countries in the world to recognize the People's Republic of China as the official government of China. Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru also became the first foreign leader to visit the PRC in China in 1954, this time to meet with the PRC leader Mao Zedong. Nehru described the visit as the most important foreign mission of his life. He considered India and China to be very similar. He believed as a newly free nation, they couldn't trust the West. They needed to depend on each other to grow their economy and improve living conditions for their citizens. They jointly signed and advocated for the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. But peace, it didn't last long. As soon as the CCP came into power in 1950, they forcibly took over the autonomous region of Tibet by sending loads of military personnel. I have a full video on this story, which was actually demonetized and restricted by YouTube the first time I uploaded it. Good times. I highly recommend you check it out for the full details on this story. But here's a quick recap. After taking over the region in 1950, the CCP slowly kept increasing its military presence in Tibet. As you can imagine, this really pissed off the local Tibetan population, as the CCP was not giving them their religious and cultural freedom. Chairman Mao wanted Tibet to be a Chinese territory. It didn't matter to him that the people there had their own culture and history. So in 1958, a rebellion broke out in Tibet against CCP forces. Tibetans wanted to kick out the CCP and take back their land. But Mao decided to send in even more forces to reassert his dominance. Local Tibetan rebels stood no chance against the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, who had a numbers advantage and experience on their side. India was closely following this clampdown. India had always had a friendly relationship with Tibet, including an economic relationship where North India would freely trade with Tibet. Indian leaders decided not to get involved in this fight, as to not cause a war with their neighbor. Mao, on the other hand, did not share the same feelings about keeping the peace. Declassified documents from decades later have shown that Mao was always paranoid that India was colluding with the USA and the Soviets to overthrow Chinese leadership. Looking back, this really doesn't make any sense. The USA and the USSR were in a pretty intense Cold War in the 1960s, and while India was a neutral nation that was friendly with both sides, I highly doubt the USA and the Soviet Union would set aside the Cold War and collude together to overthrow the leadership in China. Anyway, coming back to the Tibet story. In 1959, the Dalai Lama, fearing for his life in Tibet, fled to India, where he was granted asylum. This, of course, didn't please Chairman Mao, as he saw this action as India playing a role in supporting the rebels against the CCP. This in turn made him more aggressive towards India, and Mao decided to show his aggression by encroaching on India's borders. Speaking of borders, there's one point I quickly want to go over that's actually pretty important. In 1914, while India was still under British control, representatives from Britain, China, and Tibet gathered to determine the status of Tibet. China agreed to allow Tibet to be an autonomous region and remain under Chinese control, but they refused to put the promise in a treaty. Britain and Tibet, on the other hand, signed a treaty creating this line called the McMahon Line. India, to this day, accepts the McMahon Line as the official legal border between India and Tibet. The CCP, on the other hand, well, they didn't accept the McMahon Line, and in 1959, they kept pushing the limits at these borders to show their displeasure. This caused both sides to increase their military presence around the border. And then, in August of 1959, the first bloody clash erupted between the two nations. On the west side of the border, Chinese soldiers pushed into Indian territory. Then, a month later, clashes happened on the east border. This is when India learned that China had built a road inside of Indian territory, which has remained a pretty big issue to this day. To settle these issues, China offered India the west side of the border if India agrees to give China more territory on the east side. India, of course, declined this offer, and firefights kept happening for the next few years. Then, in 1962, Chinese soldiers discovered an Indian post in territory that they believed to be under China's borders. This news traveled to Mao, and he saw this as the final straw. Mao decided to send tens of thousands of soldiers in secret to both east and west sides of disputed borders. The People's Liberation Army swiftly launched an attack on both sides, surprising the Indian soldiers who were both outnumbered and inexperienced. The PLA, on the other hand, had plenty of fighting experience from their wars in Korea, Vietnam, and Taiwan. Indian troops suffered a humiliating defeat, and the CCP was able to capture much of Indian territory. The Indian army tried setting up a counteroffensive by bringing in more soldiers, but Mao was ready for it and squashed it pretty easily. This is when India asked the USA military for help to take back its territory. At this time, the USA was one of the only two countries who had nukes, the second one being the Soviet Union. Surprisingly, this was also one of the few issues that the USA and the Soviets agreed on. They both saw China as the aggressor in this situation, and since China didn't want to experience their own Hiroshima, they decided to withdraw most of their troops from Indian territory. However, the CCP did decide to keep control of a piece of Indian territory here in the Aksai China region, the same area where they had built a road connecting Xiancheng to Lhasa. Remember this, as this is an issue still to this day. Another ideological goal Mao had with this attack was to stop India from aligning with the USA in the Cold War. Mao's thinking was that if he can show India that China is much stronger, India will be afraid to do anything that will piss off China. But this attack kind of caused the exact opposite to happen. India and the US had become even closer, as they both now had a common enemy in China. This war also changed the borders between India and China. Now this is where the problems start. China attacked India, captured territory, and the new unofficial border was basically in Indian territory. In 1967, another war broke out, and this time India was able to push back some of the Chinese soldiers and regained some of its territories. This changed what China controlled in terms of territory versus what China believed to be its territory. China believes that everything claimed in 1962 is a part of China, but it lost some of that in 1967. India still honors the McMahon Line Agreement and believes that China is still illegally occupying Indian territory. This is the reason behind a lot of subsequent clashes that have happened here. Both countries have soldiers patrolling the area, and both countries have different definitions of where their borders end. I mean, you can tell why this is a recipe for clashes, right? Luckily, both countries realize that. But China refused to come to a peaceful agreement about the border dispute. However, they did agree that soldiers from both countries cannot use military weapons against each other, meaning no guns allowed in the 2-mile strip around the supposed line of actual control. These border disagreements are a big reason behind the India-China bitterness towards each other. But the problems don't stop here. As China grew economically, its ambitions on the world stage grew as well. After Mao's passing, Deng Xiaoping opened China up to the rest of the world with his open-door policy. This policy quite literally changed China's economy and its place in the world. It was able to attract foreign businesses to China and quickly transform the country into a manufacturing hub. Millions of people were lifted out of poverty, and China went from a farming nation to the second biggest economy in the world. But as the population started getting older and growth from attracting foreign manufacturing slowed down, the CCP was forced to look elsewhere for future growth. So it decided to feed two birds with one stone. You see, for a nation to be a superpower, for it to be a formidable force on the world stage, it needs to increase its influence with other nations, and it needs to decrease its dependency on its enemies. In short, China needed to get stronger and minimize its weaknesses. Now we skip forward a little bit in our story, because this plan was set in motion by Xi Jinping when he was elected.
Taking the center stage, China's new president and commander-in-chief of the People's Liberation Army, Xi Jinping.
Xi Jinping. As votes were counted, there was little surprise.
He got 99.86% of the vote.
China's Belt and Road Initiative. The BRI is a gigantic plan for a global network of ports, roads, railways, and other infrastructure to connect China to the world.
After being elected president, Xi Jinping launched the most ambitious project in history to increase China's influence around the world. China would give out loans to poor, struggling nations in the guise of helping nations that once struggled like they did. But in return, China gained control over countries with valuable resources or in a strategic location. Now you may ask, what if these poor countries can't pay back the loans? Well, China would then get control over important resources like gold, silver, oil, and access. China carefully used loans to gain influence on struggling nations and also choke out its enemies. A prime example being India. If you look at the map of the Belt and Road Initiative, you can clearly see that there's one country that's left out. Not only that, it seems like India is being encircled by this project that is controlled by China. Before we get into how China is doing that exactly, let's first go over why China is doing this. You see, China believes it needs to do this in order to survive. China's economy is very interconnected to the rest of the world, especially to Western countries. Around 1/5 of China's GDP is from its exports, the USA being its biggest export partner, accounting for more than $500 billion or 17% of all of China's exports. The dependency doesn't stop there. If you look at China's top 10 export partners, 9 of them are US allies. More than 50% of China's exports are going to countries that are likely to side with the USA if there's a war. Additionally, China is one of the biggest importers of oil. China imports almost double the amount of oil that the USA does, and the majority of that oil flows from the Middle East, which is transported through the Indian Ocean. All of this oil passes through what some might consider to be one of the most important geopolitical choke points here in the Strait of Malacca. It's projected that 80% of China's oil flows through this strait. This strait is in the territorial waters of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. This strait is a very big weakness for China. In case of any war or political disagreement, this strait could easily be blocked off by enemies like India or the USA. Without access to this route, it's very hard for China to get the energy to fuel its economy, let alone a war. In today's world, oil is the lifeblood of the economy and its government. China's solution to this problem is to build its own alternate route, using the Belt and Road Initiative. China has built pipelines both in Myanmar and Pakistan from the coast to intercity China. It secured long port leases in Pakistan and Sri Lanka. Similarly, China has also set up a military base in Djibouti to control Bab el-Mandeb, a vital strait off the coast of Djibouti that links the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. Persian Gulf and Asian exports bound for Western markets must first pass through Bab el-Mandeb before reaching the Suez Canal. Between 12.5% and 20% of all global trade passes through this strait. Only 8 miles from China's base is Camp Lemonnier. After seeing all the moves China has been making, a lot of military experts have pointed out that the Belt and Road is not just a geo-economic plan. It also has a military strategic advantage. The ports have increasingly come to play a potentially more menacing role, as dual-use ports that can give the strengthened Chinese Navy a global reach it lacked entirely just a few years ago. These strategic investments are nicknamed the String of Pearls, as the goal is to encircle India and put pressure on New Delhi. India was aware of this already, but the war in Ukraine showed every country in the world how important it is to secure your economic interest. In the modern world, wars can be won and lost before even stepping foot on the battlefield. India realized that, in the case of a war, China's String of Pearls can be used as a way to choke off India's access to the world, on top of safeguarding Chinese interests. Adding to this, countries that received Chinese money were slow to criticize China whenever it would start skirmishes on the disputed border with India, like it did in 2017 and 2020. There's also a rumor that China plans to start setting up military bases in countries that received Chinese loans. And of course, this was undoubtedly stressful for New Delhi, as it didn't want to be surrounded by the Chinese military. So, India started laying out its own plan to safeguard its economic interests. But it didn't just stop there. Later in the video, we'll go over how India is taking advantage of China's trade war with the USA to hurt China where it's the strongest, its manufacturing prowess. But first, let's go over how India is countering China's military. To counter the String of Pearls, India started its own alliance to encircle China, nicknamed the Necklace of Diamonds. India is expanding its naval bases and is also improving relations with strategically placed countries to counter China's strategies. In 2018, India partnered with Singapore and Indonesia to get access to their naval bases of Changi and Sabang. This increased India's influence and access to the Strait of Malacca, one of the most important choke points for China and the rest of the world in terms of trade. That same year, India also got military access to the port of Duqm in Oman. This port facilitates India's crude imports from the Persian Gulf. In addition to this, the Indian facility is located right between 2 important Chinese pearls, Djibouti in Africa and Gwadar in Pakistan. India has also signed an agreement with Seychelles for a naval base in the region, which will increase India's presence near the African continent. While doing this, India has also extended credit lines to Iran and agreed to build a port in the country to extend access to trade routes in Central Asia. Additionally, India has extended credit lines in Central Asia to countries like Mongolia, where Modi has agreed to develop a bilateral air corridor. New Delhi has invested a lot in policies to improve relations with Japan and Vietnam. These relations have helped increase Indian trade and, consequently, India's influence on countries around China. But India realized this alone isn't enough. It has also taken big steps towards speeding up its economic growth while taking business away from China. You see, the China-US trade war and COVID provided countries like India with a unique opportunity. Because of economic growth in the past couple of decades, living standards and wages in China have gone up dramatically. This has become an issue for companies that moved to China for their low labor costs. Furthermore, tariffs from the trade war have added even more costs, and the headache of operating in China increased multiple-fold because of Xi's COVID clampdown. This is where companies started looking outwards for their manufacturing needs. For many countries, India provided a perfect solution. India's population is fast-growing, and according to the UN, it's officially now the biggest nation in the world, overtaking China this year. Furthermore, the Indian population is a lot younger when compared to China's aging demographic. The median age in India is 28, a lot younger when compared to China's 38. A big portion of Indian workers speak English. In fact, India has the second largest English-speaking population, only behind the USA. This definitely makes things a lot easier for companies looking to set up shop in India. Certain companies have already noticed these benefits and taken advantage of them. One example of this is Apple, which has already moved some of its iPhone production to the Indian states of Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, and is exploring moving its iPad manufacturing to the South Asian nation. JP Morgan analysts even made calculations, and their projections show that 1 in 4 iPhones would be made in India by 2025. India is simply capitalizing on the vulnerabilities that COVID exposed in China. The need for Apple to reduce its dependence on China as a manufacturing center has been clear for many years, but the impact of the pandemic at the world's biggest iPhone assembly plant really underlined the problem. The COVID-19 related disruption was estimated to cost the company $1 billion weekly. It makes sense that Apple wants to avoid this kind of mess again. The Indian government is welcome to deals, as Indian Prime Minister Modi has been working on attracting foreign direct investments since he took office in 2014, sending FDI to a record $83.6 billion in the past fiscal year. With low-cost labor available, low cost of production, and a willing government, it's not hard to see why a good portion of business is leaving China for India. At the current rate, India stands to take a lot of China's business. Because of all this, the UN predicts that India's economy is expected to grow at 6.7% in 2024, compared to the measly 5% expected by China's economy. And it's not just next year. Many organizations forecast that India's economy is expected to grow at a much faster rate for years to come, compared to China's economy. India has already started putting this growth to good use. It's now lending money to neighbors in order to avoid having them indebted to Chinese loans. It has given $8 billion to Bangladesh, $2.1 billion to bail out Sri Lanka after a recent collapse, $1.7 billion to Nepal, $13 billion to the Maldives, and a few more. While India lags far behind China in its overseas lending, New Delhi has stepped up its efforts in recent years, providing tens of billions of dollars in credit to neighboring countries, including financially distressed BRI recipients like Sri Lanka. Indian companies have also expanded rapidly in the region, providing a counterweight to Chinese commercial activity. Indian policymakers see countering BRI as vital to avoid being surrounded by pro-Chinese governments and infrastructure they speculate could one day serve Beijing's military interests. India has definitely stepped up its efforts in containing China. India publicly downplays the competition with China, but its actions show India doesn't want to be held hostage to China's economic or military might. Recently, the first bloody clashes in 45 years took place at the India-China border. But you might not have seen this news because a lot of traditional news organizations are not good at properly covering important geopolitical news. That's why I launched Global Recaps, a geopolitical newsletter that covers important geopolitical news in a simplified manner. Every evening, I send out an email directly to your inbox covering important stories that you can read in just a few minutes. Best of all, this is completely free, and you can sign up right now by clicking on the link in the description. Pakistan is in big trouble. For lack of a better term, matters in the country are a hot mess right now. About 7 months ago, I made a video detailing the severity of the Pakistan crisis. I talked about how they got into a bind and what it would take to resolve it. I'll link the video in the description for those who want to watch it. Since then, however, the situation in Pakistan seems to have just gotten worse. And now, the nation is on the brink of a civil war. You might think of this as a them problem, but the situation in Pakistan has global ramifications. Pakistan is a nuclear-armed nation that is home to over 230 million citizens. Domestic as their affairs may be, the collapse of Pakistan would not only drag Asia, but the entire world with it. Let's dive into what exactly is troubling the nation and what could happen if Pakistan's woes are ignored. A quick interlude. Look, I hate to be a prophet of doom, but someone's got to report the uglier side of the news to show that the world is not always sunshine and rainbows. You can help validate my efforts in pursuit of enlightenment by liking this video to increase our reach on YouTube. Videos like these, well, they tend not to do so well, so maybe your likes can change that. Alright, back to the video. The way I see it, Pakistan's problems come in two forms. There are the economic woes that are threatening to collapse the nation, and then there are the political woes that threaten civil war. I'll break this video into those two sections so we better understand each one of them and how they feed into each other in order to create this hot mess that we have on our hands. To say Pakistan is dealing with an economic crisis is no longer adequate to describe the depth of the scenario. The better word is collapse. Pakistan is facing a complete economic collapse. Whatever problems you have heard of, Pakistan is probably going through them. From back-breaking inflation, a depreciating currency, and precariously low foreign reserves, Pakistan has got it all. Let's dive deeper, shall we? To start with, Pakistan is experiencing what is called a balance of payments crisis. In short, the country has been spending more on trade than it has brought in, and this has the obvious effects of depleting its foreign currency reserves faster than it can fill them. For a nation like Pakistan, this is not good at all. Pakistan is very reliant on imports, with net imports far exceeding its exports, so this means that the nation is always buying. For them to have low foreign currency reserves means that they have a low buying capacity on the international market. At one point this year, it was estimated that they only had 3 weeks' worth of money left for imports. This came after the reserves had reached an 8-year low. To add to their misfortune, in the last year, the US dollar has rallied in strength. This is good for the US, but for countries that import heavily, like Pakistan, it means that there's more financial pressure as they need more money to buy the US dollar, the currency in which they use for transactions on the global market. Add a powerful dollar and already sky-high global prices due to Russia's war in Ukraine, and you have a disaster. But that's not the only challenge that comes with having a shortage of foreign currency. This shortage presents several problems for the nation. On one hand, it forces them to start borrowing more to keep up with imports. I've already mentioned in previous videos how unfavorable the loans Pakistan gets from China are. The interest rates are high, the payback periods are low, and the collateral risk is not balanced. Them needing more money means leveraging more of Pakistan's tomorrow to pay for today's mistakes. At present, China already owns 30% of Pakistan's foreign debt. Adding to the unfavorable terms of that debt, this is a bomb waiting to explode. Also, because the nation still needs to function, the already low foreign currency reserves keep getting depleted. In addition, the government's artificial props to keep the rupee strong have the unfortunate impact of weighing on the rupee's value. So what are we left with? Higher debt, pressure to repay debt, an ever-increasing cost of importing goods, and a weak currency. Can you see now how bad this has become? But just hold on. It gets worse.
A country on the brink of disaster.
Pakistan's economic collapse.
Inflation in Pakistan touched a 60-year high.
Prices of basic commodities have been doubled.
Food has become unaffordable for millions.
Pakistan is going through its worst economic crisis
since March 1965.
Growing, based on all of the issues listed above, inflation has had perfect room to grow. In February of this year, inflation surged to 31.5%, its highest level since 1974, according to the latest figures released by the Pakistan Bureau of Statistics on March 1st. This has left the country of over 230 million citizens in quite a conundrum. You see, prices of goods domestically are increasing. Everything from basic goods to essential commodities is more expensive now than they've been in a long time. When you couple that with the fact that money is losing value, well, it's a disaster. Pakistanis are starving, and the average person is barely staying afloat. Fathers are struggling to make enough, and mothers can barely ration what little they have. All this is because the country's economic policies are in shambles. The government has run out of options, and for the time being has been grasping to find whatever it can get in loans in a bid to ease their troubles. The most open channel for that has been the International Monetary Fund. Pakistan's government has been holding talks to resume a $6.5 billion loan program that has been essentially suspended since last November. The IMF has put forward a set of demands for the release of a $1.1 billion installment that includes the liberalization of the exchange rate, the removal of subsidies in various sectors, and the raising of taxes. I will mention why this is important when we cover the political sphere of Pakistan in just a minute. Pakistan is desperate, and they have been agreeing to all of the IMF's requirements. I cannot overemphasize just how desperate the nation is right now. Also, because of the issues with foreign currency, economic activity has dropped massively in the nation, heavily affecting all the major companies. This has had a trickle-down effect on the citizens, sending already struggling people into economic oblivion. Several of the nation's biggest companies have halted operations as they ran out of raw materials or foreign exchange, which has compounded the troubles of the economy. Heavyweight companies like Suzuki, Gandhara Tire and Rubber Company, GSK PLC's Pakistan unit, Ingro Fertilizers Limited, Amreli Steels Limited, Milat Tractors Limited, and Diamond Industries Limited have shut their factories indefinitely or suspended operations. Their statements all talk about the same thing. They are struggling with sourcing raw materials or have a shortage of cash. For luxury-oriented companies, it's a drop in demand. This has served to increase unemployment in the nation. Try having unemployed people who are starving in an economy that is getting worse and worse by the day. No wonder we're seeing more and more of this. Unfortunately, it's not just Pakistan. Things are unraveling for many countries around the world. While I am trying my best to cover all of the major geopolitical news stories, it's a very fast-moving environment when it comes to geopolitics. And that is why I launched my newsletter, where every week I send out major global news straight to your email inbox. You can sign up right now by clicking on the link in the description, and best of all, it's free.
Pakistani security forces
trying to arrest
former Prime Minister
Imran Khan.
Protests erupted in major Pakistani cities.
Hundreds of
supporters of Khan clashed with police, who then fired tear gas and water cannons at the crowd.
Were Pakistan united right now, we would say that the country will somehow bounce back fairly quickly. But the problem is that Pakistan is not united. Not even a little bit. The political turmoil in the nation is threatening to rip the country apart. Let's talk about how messy the political situation is. You know how the world debates the age-old question, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, Pakistan has a similar question. What came first, the economic crisis or the political crisis? I won't dive into that today, but I will say this. Both crises have taken advantage of the presence of the other to bring Pakistan as a nation to the brink of collapse. But looking at the political situation in particular, well, the nation is in a mess. It looks like the nation is becoming more difficult to govern with each passing year. The root of the current political turmoil that the nation is facing right now is rooted in one name and one person: Imran Khan. Khan served as the 22nd Prime Minister of Pakistan from 2018 up until 2022. That is when he was forcibly removed from power through a no-confidence motion in the National Assembly. Khan claimed that it was a US-led conspiracy to eliminate him, and ever since then he has been staging mass rallies aimed at reinstalling himself as the prime minister. Typically in any other country, this would die down, but Khan commands a huge following, and he has very loyal supporters. This means that his rallies and criticism of the government have ears, and this is threatening to split the country in two. What has made it worse is that the protests have been met with severe police brutality. This has resulted in several deaths, injuries, and arrests as the months go on. In response, the protests have begun taking more militant forms, with protesters arming themselves with sticks. This is a very dangerous situation, as it is a few steps away from a military conflict. A few armed protesters and everything can go very, very wrong. We are looking at a country that can break into civil war any day now. And what heightens the protesters' beliefs is the assassination attempt that was made on Imran Khan's life. The gunman who made the attempt on the former prime minister's life at a rally last year in November wounded Khan, but Khan survived. This has made his message that much stronger and has given him a bit of a messiah complex. Were Khan to be taken out, it is almost guaranteed that civil war would break out. The only string that is keeping Pakistan from a military conflict is the fact that all the major political parties, despite their fierce differences, are invested in keeping the country intact. No one wants a war, but it is becoming increasingly harder to keep that option off the table. These political woes themselves have made the economic crisis worse. The frequent leadership changes have made it hard for Pakistan to have a long-term strategy. Instead, each government comes with measures that are short-term and will only serve to make the people happy in the here and now. With each new government, Pakistan is getting buried in more problems. As the economic problems heighten and the political struggles reach a boiling point, the future of Pakistan is very much in limbo. But that's not all. There's more. The last year hasn't really been kind to Pakistan. And in addition to bad economic policies, there have been unforeseen challenges as well. One of the chief incidents was that Pakistan was hit by floods. A lot of really bad floods.
In Pakistan,
Floods across much of the country have killed over 1,000 people and
affected the lives of more than 30 million people.
People need saving and there isn't much time.
There are now fears of acute food shortages.
Around 250,000 people at risk of drowning.
Many districts are still out of reach as roads and bridges are swept away.
Weeks of unrelenting monsoon rain have wreaked havoc on vital infrastructure.
Military helicopters carry out daily rescue operations.
Families who've lost their homes are sleeping on the roadside.
Shocked, shattered, and starving.
The floods were massive. They affected all 4 of the country's provinces and approximately 15% of the population. The floods were so bad that about 1/3 of Pakistan's landmass was covered in water, resulting in the displacement of millions of poor Pakistani citizens. In addition to the heavy loss of life and emotional burdens, these floods have left Pakistan in quite a pickle. The nation has a huge bill to foot for reconstruction and aid, and this has added to the strains on the government budget. A budget that was already struggling. According to the World Bank estimates, Pakistan needs at least $16 billion to somewhat handle the losses and damages incurred. Yeah, you heard that right. $16 billion. This is coming at a time when the entire nation's reserve fund is just $3 billion. It's a sad situation. To add to this natural disaster, the weakness in Pakistan's political and economic situation has resulted in third parties taking advantage of the nation. One of these third-party groups is terrorists. In the past few months, the nation has seen a resurgence of terrorism from radical Islamist groups, as well as ethnic militants in the resource-rich province of Baluchistan.
wreaking havoc across Pakistan is the Tehreek-e-Taliban, or the TTP.
Pakistan is on edge after the devastating Thursday attack.
The death toll in the suicide bombing at a mosque in the Pakistani city of Peshawar continues to rise.
Terrorists stormed a police compound in Pakistan's port city of Karachi yesterday, killing 3 security force members and 1 civilian.
Multiple explosions and firing were heard after unidentified armed men attacked a police station in the southern Pakistani city of Karachi.
Gunmen on the streets of Lahore, a brazen and deadly attack on a high-profile target.
The number of civilian and law enforcement casualties at the hands of the TTP have more than doubled.
The Pakistani Taliban, a horrendous branch of the Taliban that killed thousands of Pakistanis during the War on Terror, announced its return recently. I can't show you the video here because YouTube would just send a pack of rabid advertising executives to my home, but the Taliban had a member launch a horrific suicide attack that killed 101 congregants attending prayers at a mosque. Following the retreat from the US in the region, the war on terrorism has just become lopsided. Pakistan is on the short end of this, and as the attacks increase, it's looking more likely that Pakistan might share the instability that has long been felt by its neighbor, Afghanistan. The Pakistan Taliban has not relented, and several other terrorist activities have taken place, resulting in the individual death of several people. Unless Pakistan puts these activities to bed, and quickly, we might be looking at the beginning of a very big problem. The challenge is that Pakistan is facing all of these issues at once: natural disasters, terrorist resurgence, economic hardships, and political unrest. When all of these issues manifest simultaneously, it's easy to see and understand why Pakistan is on its last legs. It is painfully clear that if something does not give up soon, the next few months might result in a crisis for Asia and for the entire world as Pakistan collapses. There is hope, though, given that the IMF is willing to loan money to Pakistan, and also elections are coming up this year. The hope is that Pakistan finds its peace with the convergence of these events, or else the world will watch as crisis after crisis accelerates the fall of a great nation. Mexico's economy is on the rise. An increasing number of foreign businesses like to do business in Mexico, and it looks like this will only increase in the future. Right now, Mexico sits in the perfect storm, preparing it for an economic boom. This is due to multiple factors, both inside of Mexico and also outside in the changing international landscape. Mexico has relatively low labor costs, which attracts manufacturers looking to outsource their operations. Additionally, the country's population can provide a lot of skilled labor, which makes doing business in Mexico even more attractive. And something that separates Mexico from all the other low-cost manufacturing countries is one simple geographic reality. Mexico is located right next to the largest economy in the world, the United States of America. It's not hard to figure out why businesses like this fact. When you manufacture your products in Mexico, you can easily and cheaply export your products to the huge market in the United States. So, Mexico is a huge opportunity for manufacturing, which can attract businesses and spark economic growth. And the changing global economic environment is turning this opportunity into a reality. Right now, the United States outsources a lot of its manufacturing to China. But due to a variety of reasons, this trend seems to be shifting. It's only a matter of time before China's position as the manufacturing behemoth will crumble. China's downfall will inevitably cause Mexico's economic rise, because Chinese manufacturing will have to move somewhere else. But in a weird way, Beijing is actually trying to benefit from Mexico's rise by gaining an economic footprint in the country. In this episode, we'll go over how these complex geopolitical and economic changes are causing an economic boom in Mexico. What's happening in Mexico is very interesting, because it doesn't only affect one nation, but really the entire world. And just a side note, if you enjoy my videos, be sure to hit that like button down below. Without your help, this video won't get very far in the algorithm. It took a lot of work to cover this topic, so your support is really greatly appreciated. Thank you so much.
A tectonic shift is underway in the North American economy.
We are seeing a lot of investment from Chinese companies, and Mexico is more motivated to attract them.
The latest example of Chinese business expansion is the 850-hectare Hafusan Industrial Park.
The potential for creating as many as 7,000 jobs over the next 5 years.
And bringing their products closer to the world's largest market, the United States.
Multiple Chinese companies are now moving their manufacturing to Mexico. They've already invested billions of dollars in the country, building up factories and supply chains. This is a fascinating development because it tells us two important things. Mexico is now a very attractive place to do business, and China is, well, not that attractive anymore. After all, why are Chinese companies moving out of China if things are going well at home? The truth is, it's not going well for the country. Since the COVID pandemic hit in 2020, things are going downhill in China. The first thing we should look at are the supply chain weaknesses that were exposed during the recent years. This isn't the first time you'll hear about globalization and outsourcing manufacturing, as these concepts have shaped our modern economy. Basically, companies from Western countries have moved their manufacturing to other, cheaper countries. For decades, globalization has been a trend that countries like China benefited from enormously. Because other countries started to outsource their manufacturing, China became a manufacturing giant. China had an abundance of cheap labor, which made it the best place for manufacturing businesses. But this globalization had one huge disadvantage. It makes countries reliant on other countries. China is the world's top manufacturer, producing 28.7% of the world's manufacturing output. Because of this huge market share, global supply chains are largely reliant on the Chinese economy. And when the COVID-19 pandemic happened, this overdependence on the Chinese economy clearly showed. The long and ruthless lockdowns in China caused economic unrest and supply chain weaknesses all over the world. A lot of governments came to the same conclusion. It's not smart to have all your manufacturing in one country. Diversifying your manufacturing by outsourcing it to different countries is a lot safer, even though it comes with a heavier price tag due to more investments. For example, Apple is now diversifying its manufacturing by adding Indian companies to its supply chain. The Chinese companies moving to Mexico might be doing the same thing, diversifying their manufacturing. If something unfortunate were to happen in China, these companies would still have their manufacturing plants in Mexico up and running. But supply chain safety isn't the only motivator driving these companies in Mexico. Cheap labor certainly has a huge role to it. The quoted monthly earnings in Mexico are $874, which is significantly lower than China's quoted earnings of $1,336 per month. Chinese manufacturers want to make money, and by moving to Mexico, this gets easier due to the lower labor costs. And the costs of labor aren't the only explanation. In China, many manufacturing companies are facing acute labor shortages. The new Chinese generation is smaller than the older ones, and many young Chinese people aren't willing to work factory jobs. The reason for this is that the new generation has a higher education than the previous one, making them, well, overqualified for manual work. Basically, there are less people in China, and even less of them considering low-paying jobs. This has led to more than 80% of Chinese manufacturers facing labor shortages from 10% up to 30%. If these manufacturers don't have the people at home, they're forced to move abroad. And Chinese companies moving to Mexico fit perfectly in this trend. But the reasons for things going downhill in China aren't only economic, they're also heavily political. The turmoil that began with the US-China trade war has caused significant damage to Chinese manufacturing. In 2018, US President Donald Trump began to impose high tariffs on imports from China, which hurt Chinese businesses wanting to export to the huge US market. In one single move, he increased the taxes on $200 billion worth of goods. And President Biden, well, he didn't make the situation a whole lot better for these Chinese companies. His administration maintained the tariffs Trump imposed, which didn't help with stopping the trade war. He even went as far as to add new restrictions on the Chinese economy, most notably on the chip industry that is so crucial to the country. In deals with other countries like Japan or the Netherlands, Biden effectively destroyed the supply chains of Chinese chip manufacturers. For Chinese companies exporting to the United States, this ongoing trade war is very bad for business. This is yet another reason for Chinese manufacturing companies to now move to Mexico. Mexico is located right next to the US market, and it doesn't have the same restrictions placed on itself as China has. Adding on to this, diversifying your manufacturing to other countries is a smart move due to the same political reasons. With the situation around Taiwan getting very tense, a conflict between the United States and China is not completely out of the picture. An American four-star general predicts that the two will be at war by 2025. Now, this is a topic for a whole nother video, but these speculations do concern companies about potential geopolitical risks of doing business in China. Maybe it's safer if you have some of your manufacturing elsewhere, because a war will be pretty devastating for everyone involved. And in the terrible scenario that comes with a war, there's a good chance Mexico won't be involved. In short, there are a lot of economic and political reasons for Chinese companies now moving over to Mexico. And it isn't just Chinese companies that are moving out of their own country for Mexico. Other companies are seeing the benefits of Mexico too. American businesses that were formerly outsourcing their manufacturing to China are now considering moving to their neighboring country. For example, the car manufacturers Tesla, General Motors, and Ford are all building manufacturing plants in Mexico. And companies from Europe and other Asian countries are doing the same, especially when the United States is their primary export market. It's safe to say that the trend in global manufacturing is shifting. China's downfall in manufacturing is turning out to be Mexico's rise. As with every trend, there are push and pull factors. The push factors are that China isn't that attractive anymore for manufacturing. We've already discussed the reasons for this, which are both economic and political. So let's go over the pull factors and uncover why Mexico has great potential to be a manufacturing economy.
Mexico has surpassed China as America's top trading partner, signaling a changing dynamic within the global economy.
Mexico hosted the North American Summit with the leaders of the United States and Canada.
The North American Leaders Summit is expected to focus on economic issues and climate change, but also the situation on the U.S.-Mexican border.
Perhaps one of the greatest pull factors driving manufacturers to Mexico is the end of globalism. Many experts are speculating that globalism is reaching its final days. This major shift has to do with the increasing international tensions in the world. One of the preconditions for globalism has always been international peace and order. Connecting each individual economy with each other to form a global economy isn't an easy task. You need to have everyone on the same page, and you must provide every country with safety and assurances. After the Second World War, the United States was so strong that it could enforce this. The US-led world order provided relative stability, which led to an increasingly globalized economy as international trade flourished. But now, this global economy appears to be crumbling. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is a very good example of this. Russia challenged the Western influence in Ukraine by starting an illegal invasion. As a result, the world became a lot less stable and the global economy suffered. With China's increasingly aggressive stance regarding Taiwan, the US-led world order is also being challenged. Chinese and American interests regarding Taiwan are completely opposite, and China is showing no signs of backing off. In the scenario that this situation escalates, boy oh boy, we will definitely see the globalized economy crumble. Right now, the world is dependent on Taiwanese chips, which could turn out to be disastrous. And it's not only US enemies that make globalism difficult to execute. Its allies are also giving it a hard time. For example, the European Union is not blindly following US policy anymore. Macron has repeatedly said that he doesn't want to be a vassal for the US, and that he rather wants the EU to form an independent strategic bloc. Even US allies don't accept an American-led world order anymore. From all of these geopolitical developments, we can conclude that the United States' dominance is being challenged from multiple sides. So what on earth does this have to do with Mexico? Well, a lot, actually. With the US no longer leading the world order, the old version of globalism isn't viable anymore. Consider this. American chip manufacturers used to move their factories to other countries. Now, Biden is paying billions of dollars for them to come back. Nowadays, world leaders prefer to have a secure and robust economy at home above all the benefits globalization can offer. This is because globalism can't be safeguarded by a dominant power like the United States anymore. As a result of the crumbling world order, international relations aren't as stable as they used to be. Think about Russia or China, for example. Because of these significant changes, countries want to reduce their dependency on each other. By moving chip manufacturing to the US, Biden effectively reduces the dependency on Taiwan and China. If this trend continues, globalism is over. But Mexico might be the rare exemption to this. The United States doesn't mind being dependent on Mexico because the two are neighbors. While the globalized economy is in decay, stronger regional economies might be the solution. Regional economies are basically a watered-down version of globalism. Regional economies can have greater security and stability, but they still have some of the benefits globalism can offer. This includes things like bilateral trade with other nations and economies of scale. Therefore, an improved relationship between the US and Mexico can be vital for the future, because it can create a strong regional economy. As globalism appears to be ending, countries will need to focus on their regional economies. Especially in North America, a stronger regional economy will provide a lot of opportunities in and of itself. You could even argue that this regional economy can outperform the former globalized economy in a lot of ways. Getting goods from Mexico to the US is simply a lot faster and a lot cheaper than importing it from China. From Mexico to the US, you can transport goods via trucks, trains, or ships within a few days. When you're importing from China to the US, however, it can take multiple weeks if you have bad luck. As we've already discussed, Mexico simply has a cheaper labor force, which makes for a greater manufacturing opportunity. On top of that, Mexico doesn't face the same labor shortages as its Chinese counterpart. The tariffs for trade between Mexico and the US are also significantly lower. For trade coming from most countries, the United States asks tariffs as a form of taxation on imports. But due to the USMCA agreement, import tariffs between the US, Canada, and Mexico are minimal or even non-existent. For a lot of products, you don't have to pay an import tax when you're trading between these three countries. This is yet another benefit of a stronger regional economy. Mexico can become a powerful manufacturing hub for the United States, and the opportunities don't only stay at manufacturing. Mexico also has a highly educated workforce. Fun fact, Mexico graduates more engineers annually than the United States. This means that not only manufacturing companies, but also technology firms can grab the opportunity to outsource to Mexico. This is great news for Mexico, but also for the United States. Right now, the US is facing a critical shortage of engineers, ranging in the millions of job offers. When you look at their respective economies, Mexico and the United States complement each other pretty perfectly. The United States needs both cheap and skilled labor and a reliable trading partner, and Mexico needs jobs and companies to boost their economy. All the more reason to start a strong regional economy. Conventional wisdom would say that a good neighbor is better than a far-flung friend, which definitely applies to the US and Mexico. Sadly enough, the political reality isn't as promising. The United States and Mexico have had their issues, so to say. Illegal immigration coming from Mexico is one of the biggest political issues in America, with more than 2 million border encounters in the fiscal year of 2022 alone. Most of the migrants don't come from Mexico, however, but from other Latin American countries like Honduras and El Salvador. The reason for this mass migration is poverty and crime that many of the failed states in Latin America have failed to solve. Many Latin Americans think that they'll have a better chance in the United States, being the more stable and prosperous country in the continent. But a lot of Americans fear that mass immigration will cause problems at home, especially the Republican side of the debate. That's why Donald Trump tried to build a wall on the border to prevent migrants from illegally coming into the country. The unwanted side effect of this policy was a strained political relationship between the United States and Mexico. There was a lot of political back and forth on the necessity and the unwanted effects of the wall. Donald Trump blamed the Mexican government for not doing enough about the illegal migration issue. In turn, the Mexican government blamed him for worsening their mutual relation with the wall. Building a wall isn't good for bilateral trade, as it slows down imports and exports coming from both sides. The strained relationship isn't only to be blamed on the illegal migration, though. The high crime rate in Mexico, along with its infamous cartel violence, also causes political concern. The Mexican government doesn't have full control over its own country, because organized crime groups have become way too powerful. The most powerful cartels in Mexico have military-grade weapons and equipment, and through corruption, they also have a large political say in the country. The United States doesn't like this, because these cartels bring illegal drugs into the country with the risk of spreading violence. The ongoing fentanyl crisis has caused thousands of American deaths, and it's directly related to the cartels in Mexico who import contaminated drugs. Some politicians call for the US military to intervene in Mexico to address the issue of the cartels. The Mexican president, López Obrador, doesn't like this. He wants to solve the organized crime issue on his own and preserve his country's sovereignty. He even made the false claim that none of the fentanyl was being produced in Mexico, and that it was all America's own problem. Right now, the drug war cooperation between the United States and Mexico is at its lowest point in decades. Law enforcement from both sides are barely cooperating to solve their mutual problem. So, the issue of organized crime is also something separating the United States and Mexico. But increasing economic ties might be the way out. One of the reasons for illegal migration and organized crime is poverty, which is related to economic underdevelopment. Therefore, when Mexico gets more prosperity, it will theoretically have lower crime rates and less migration. The Mexican government will also have more money to fight issues like organized crime and illegal migration. When bilateral trade grows, Mexico's economy will be on the rise, and these issues can be resolved. That's why building a strong regional economy is one of the best ways to improve the strained relationship between the US and Mexico. The political relations are difficult, but they can be resolved once the two countries just start cooperating. We should also look at the politics inside of Mexico. Government policies have a lot of effect on the economic success of a country. And looking in the past decades, the economic growth, it hasn't been great. This chart shows that the Mexican economy hasn't experienced outstanding growth over this time period. The GDP growth rate has been irregular with ups and downs, and they haven't been fantastic in general. In fact, when we compare Mexico's GDP growth with that of the United States, it appears like there has been no economic growth at all. The opportunities for economic growth were certainly there, but the Mexican government has struggled to turn them into reality. Mexico could have been the most successful country in Latin America because it has a great opportunity for manufacturing as it shares a border with the US. But Mexico's economy hasn't outperformed other countries in Latin America in any way. That's because economic success has a lot of preconditions, like large amounts of foreign direct investment and an improved business environment. First of all, Mexico lacks infrastructure and sufficient public utilities to achieve economic success. The root cause of this problem is the lack of government taxes to fund public infrastructure projects. The government only invests 1.3% of its GDP into these projects, which is a very small amount compared to many other countries. Now, this problem could be relatively easily solved by attracting foreign direct investment. The private sector would love to invest in Mexico because of the growth opportunity ahead. With increased foreign investments, the infrastructure problem could be solved. However, Mexico doesn't attract that much capital. Foreign direct investment inflows account for only 2.6% of its GDP, which isn't a crazy high number. This is definitely not enough to solve the infrastructure problem that Mexico is currently facing. However, with more and more companies moving to Mexico for manufacturing, this foreign investment inflow will surely increase. But even with the odds in its favor, the government in Mexico is still struggling to get more companies to invest in the country. Some of the government policies are causing this deficiency. For example, in 2022, the Mexican president tried to let the government take over the energy sector, which was defeated in Congress. This move has scared multiple private energy companies, which could have invested in Mexico's underdeveloped energy infrastructure. This is just one of the many examples of government policies that scare away foreign investments coming from the private sector. President López Obrador focuses on state-led growth, which decreases the impact companies can have in Mexico. This isn't helpful with achieving economic growth, because the huge opportunities for Mexican growth lie in the private sector. The business environment is also a reason for the lack of economic success. The Mexican government tries to give businesses all kinds of incentives in order to spark economic growth. This is the case with the maquila factories near the US-Mexico border, which have received multiple benefits from the government. These factories manufacture goods for American companies just south of the border, and they don't have to pay taxes or import duties to the Mexican government. The Mexican government has also created various special economic zones to improve the business environment. They provide various benefits to the companies in the economic zones, such as having to pay no income tax for 10 years and no import taxes. In a lot of ways, the business environment is great for large corporations. But the problem is that the rest of the economy just lags behind. Nearly 30% of Mexico's economy is informal, meaning that it's not registered nor taxed by the government. In fact, nearly 60% of Mexicans are employed in this informal sector. This has a huge negative impact because the government can't collect taxes on this informal economy, and 60% of Mexicans don't enjoy Social Security. One of the reasons for the informal economy is the excessive regulations that make doing business in the formal economy very hard. Paying taxes alone takes Mexican firms 241 hours each year on average, something that small businesses can't afford to do. The huge informal economy is directly one of the reasons for Mexico's sluggish economic growth. Countries with large informal economies generally suffer from low productivity, poor governance, and high inequality. These are things that have dragged Mexico's economy down and have historically caused low growth rates. Mexico might attract a lot of large corporations, but it also has to solve the informal economy in order to grow. Adding on to the complexity of the issues is that the situation varies dramatically per state in Mexico. Looking at the GDP per capita for every state, you can see that there is a huge difference. In some states, the GDP per capita is about $10,000, while in other states, it's $40,000 per capita or even higher. That's 4 times the difference, just on a regional scale. This can be attributed to poor government policies that aren't organizing things well. But it can also be blamed on different policies on a state level. Some states, like Mexico City, Nuevo León, or Baja California, have received relatively high amounts of foreign direct investment as compared to others. This is because some states are just better at attracting businesses than others. These states also have better legislation, solving the problems of the informal economy more efficiently. But to truly achieve economic success in Mexico, every state needs to grow, and the other states shouldn't get left behind. This is something that the country lacks right now. However, all these political issues can be solved eventually. When the country takes an example from successful states like Nuevo León, Mexico could work out a solution to the problems. If the entirety of Mexico manages to attract businesses and to grow its formal economy, an economic boom is inevitable. At least, that's what the governor of Nuevo León predicts. Many problems can be solved when this economic boom happens. For Mexico, it could reduce poverty and the issues related to it. In general, the quality of life will improve and Mexicans will get more prosperous. For the United States, Mexico could turn out to be an invaluable partner, with all the benefits the bilateral trade can offer, such as proximity and reliance. The stronger regional economy in North America will be a serious competitor to China's economy, which has a huge impact on global geopolitics. Talking about China, the CCP has decided between 2 strategies when it comes to this change in Mexico. It can either try to compete with Mexico and fight for its own manufacturing industry, or it can cooperate with Mexico and gain influence within the country. At first glance, Beijing trying to compete with Mexico is a viable option. After all, China's economy is more than 10 times bigger than that of Mexico. China's population is also more than 10 times bigger than Mexico's population. And I know that economic and demographic figures coming from China aren't that reliable, but China certainly has an advantage in size. Mexico won't be able to take over China's manufacturing completely, so China will try to remain competitive on a global level. But when it comes to the US market, well, the story is a little bit different. In the US market, the competition between China and Mexico isn't a story of David and Goliath. In 2021, China exported about $600 billion to the US. In the same year, Mexico exported about $400 billion to its northern neighbor. In the US market, Mexico is a serious competitor to China. Because of the shifting trend in North America, with a stronger regional economy, China stands to lose some serious market share. In this market, it'll be harder for China to compete. That's why the CCP is adopting a different policy: cooperation with Mexico. The CCP doesn't want to lose control over the US export market, because this is one of its biggest strategic advantages. With Mexico increasing its market share, the only way for the CCP to retain this advantage is through getting influence in Mexico. One of the ways to do this is by building infrastructure projects, which the CCP is trying to do in the country. For example, Chinese companies have signed multi-billion-dollar railroad contracts with the Mexican government. This policy of gaining influence through infrastructure projects isn't new for the CCP. However, this traditional way for China to gain influence isn't going to cut it. Mexico is one of the few emerging markets that isn't part of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. This is partially because Mexico doesn't want to have too much Chinese investment within its borders. If Mexico would take tons of loans from China, it could upset the United States, their biggest trading partner. But luckily for the CCP, there's another way of getting influence in Mexico, and that's taking over a part of the Mexican economy itself. As of 2022, there were 1,289 Chinese companies investing in Mexico. This includes Chinese car manufacturers like BYD, Changan Motors, or MG Motors. Of course, these are private investments. But in China, companies aren't that independent from the CCP, as they have to follow state policies set by Xi Jinping himself. Through these private investments, the Chinese government is gaining a foothold in the Mexican economy. This could be Beijing's master plan to counter an independent American economy. After all, importing from Chinese companies in Mexico isn't much different than importing out of China itself. And this is bad news for the United States, because it desperately wants to be independent from China. But it's clear that the CCP has a different agenda. To wrap it all up, an economic boom in Mexico seems more than logical. Mexico and the United States could grow their bilateral trade in a move to strengthen the regional economy. Cheap and reliable labor just south of the border is all the US can wish for when it comes to manufacturing. And Mexico, which is still struggling to grow its economy, would love to expand its exports to the biggest economy in the world. Because their interests are aligned, the political differences between Mexico and the United States can be solved. The political situation within Mexico could also improve, with states like Nuevo León leading the way. The question now becomes, will this new alliance make the United States independent from China? The United States hopes to replace Chinese manufacturing with manufacturing coming from Mexico, for economic and political reasons. But the CCP isn't letting this happen, as it's moving hundreds of Chinese companies to the country. One thing is certain though, Mexico is the perfect storm for an economic boom. With all these developments, Mexico could become a manufacturer's paradise. At the start of 2022, rumors of Sweden and Finland considering joining NATO had started appearing in the mainstream media. Russia is pushing Finland and Sweden toward NATO. Finland and Sweden are done with deference to Russia. These rumors received a lot of criticism, as Russia was still portrayed as a very powerful country with a military that could march all the way to Paris, if only given the reason. Little did the critics know, the Russians can always find a reason. And if they actually could stage a successful invasion, or rather if they thought they could stage one, they wouldn't hesitate. Chances are, the closer you live to Russia, the more obvious this seems to you. Finland shares a 1,300-kilometer, about 833-mile, border with Russia. And it seems like the logic applies to both it and its immediate neighbors to the west. Less than 3 months after Russia invaded Ukraine, Finland and Sweden applied for NATO membership together. But was this really a sudden U-turn, or rather, a logical ending to a decades-long process? In this video, we're going to talk about exactly that. This is by far my longest video ever, and it took a really long time to make. So, if you appreciate the effort, can you please hit that like button? It would mean the world to me, and it would help out this video a lot with the YouTube algorithm. Thanks. The history of Sweden's and Finland's neutrality stems from as early as 1809, when, as a result of the Finnish War between the Kingdom of Sweden and the Russian Empire, Finland was made into an autonomous part of Russia. And from there, the story of these two Scandinavian regions have quite a lot of differences, so we'll cover them separately. In 1917, Finland declared independence after the Russians were weakened by the February Revolution and then the October Revolution. Shortly after, though, because of the century-long history of Finland being a part of Russia, a mirror image of the empire's civil unrest started to emerge in Finland itself. Conservative whites, backed by the Tsarist Russians, and socialist Reds, backed by Bolshevik Russians, fought a devastating war, which ended after the German Empire intervened at the whites' request. The whites won in Finland, but their main supporters from Russia lost to the Bolsheviks, and the German occupiers lost the World War. The radical Reds in Finland were already marginalized, so instead of igniting a new war, this turned out to be the best possible outcome for the Finns. It allowed their country to start breaking away from the severe Russian influences that caused the Civil War in the first place, and it prevented Germans from occupying the region for too long. Independent Finland was slowly recovering under the control of whites. As the war-torn country was slowly yet steadily healing its wounds, a new cruel invasion was about to start from the east. In late 1939, the Winter War broke out. During that time, the Finns defended their country fiercely, but could not stage a large-scale counteroffensive. This resulted in the Moscow Peace Treaty, which the Finns were, to say the least, not satisfied with. Because of this, Finland now sought help from Germany, which was unsatisfied with the outcome of the Winter War in its own way. Invading the Soviet Union was not a good strategic decision, though. Thankfully for the entire world, the Wehrmacht was defeated. Finland was still at its 1940 border, but now it was not in the position to complain. The hatred for Russians was there, but the Russians themselves were just over the border. Any intentions of allying with the USA were enough of a reason for the Soviets to initiate yet another war. The only viable way for the Finns to save their democracy and independence was neutrality. After the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia was fairly good at posing as a country that Europe shouldn't worry about. The two Russian invasions of Chechnya received little to no attention from the Western media. The invasion of Georgia ended quickly and with little casualties. Syria is simply too far away to care about. And the Russians made the land grab of Crimea and Donbass complicated enough for most people in the West to stop forming their opinion at a point where they needed knowledge of a sizable chunk of Ukrainian history. Learning all that, on top of their other activities, was understandably just too much, so they believed in the possibility of a peaceful resolution, or at least maintaining the status quo. Secretly, though, the Cold War never ended for Finland. But in the eyes of the public, Russia wasn't that dangerous. Why don't we just stay neutral, as always? Surely we don't want to be the provocateurs. Sweden, unlike Finland, didn't lose its sovereignty at the start of the 19th century. After it lost control over Finland, it joined the Allies to fight against Napoleon and defeated the Danes in 1813. As a result, Denmark ceded Norway to the Swedes. In the next year, Norway tried to declare independence, but was invaded by Sweden again. For the rest of the century, Norway stayed independent except for its foreign affairs, which were controlled by the Swedish king. In the First World War, after Norway declared full independence, the Swedish foreign policy was not really neutral. It was more like slightly siding with different powers at different stages of the war. Between 1920 and 1939, though, the country's efforts were focused on avoiding German and Soviet influence. When World War II started, this policy persisted. Despite being surrounded by German allies and occupied states, it managed to stay neutral at the little expense of providing Germany with a passage to Norway and trading steel with it. This neutrality policy was highly popular among the Swedes, so it's only natural that the country had no intention of joining NATO throughout the course of the Cold War. It did accept the Marshall Plan funding, though, unlike Finland. Neutrality is often associated with peace, or even freedom from participating in wars. In reality, it's not that simple. To maintain neutrality, a country must either be able to defend itself from an invasion of a superior power, or become allies with stronger nations, but indirectly, without angering their enemies. As with everything, in Sweden and Finland's case, it's a mix of both. But let's see what this mix is really all about. First, let's look at the defense spending. Sweden's military spending has been in a steady decline from 4% of its GDP in 1960 to just 1.3% in 2021, which is far less than the NATO target of 2%. Finland, being closer to the danger zone, didn't have that luxury. So it goes to figure that in the same period, it didn't really change that much and fluctuated around 2%. But when looking at the raw numbers adjusted for inflation, we can see quite a different picture. This chart more or less shows the real dynamics of how much Sweden invested in its military over the last 60 years. We can clearly see that this number only started a long-term decline in 1992, just after the collapse of the Soviet Union. As for Finland, though, similar trends can be seen, but only in the last decade. And in 2004, it almost completely negated. Perhaps its government sensed that the Russians were preparing for a new attempt at restoring their empire? The Finns knew it all, didn't they? Well, it may have been one of the key reasons, but it's certainly not the only one. As of 2021, Finland and Sweden have the 15th and 12th biggest military budgets in Europe, respectively. They are an order of magnitude smaller than those of the UK, France, or Germany, but still enough to maintain rather capable armies. So, what are these armies really made of? Sweden's population is 10.5 million people. Among them, 2 million males and 1.6 million females between the ages of 18 and 47 are considered fit for military service. Notably, Sweden is one of the few countries where conscription is mandatory and gender neutral. The size of the regular army is relatively small, at just under 23.6 thousand active personnel and 31,000 in reserves. The Swedish army possesses 121 German Leopard tanks, 1,300 Finnish and 800 domestically produced armored vehicles of various types, and around 170 mortar and artillery guns, all of which were also produced in Finland or Sweden. The country's navy has a few submarines, corvettes, large patrol boats, and around 350 smaller vessels. All of that originates from Sweden, and some of the small boats like the CB-90 were even exported to various countries. Where the Swedish armed forces really shine is their air force, which has over 200 aircraft, among which 94 are fighter jets made by Saab. You might recognize this name if you know a thing or two about the automobile industry. But this Saab hasn't had much to do with cars since 1990, when the automobile division was spun off and sold to General Motors in 2 steps. The defense Saab, however, is doing well. And apparently it also has a really nice website that strangely makes you feel like they just sell mugs and t-shirts. Anyway, the reason why Sweden has such a disproportionately strong air force compared to the other branches of their military is rather easy to understand. This is the Gotland Island. It's not only the biggest one in the Baltic Sea, but also one of the most conveniently located islands there. Less than 300 kilometers to the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad, and at the same time, less than 700 kilometers to St. Petersburg. All while being separated from Russia with hundreds of kilometers of water, Gotland is one of the key strategic points in the region. During the Cold War, it held even more importance as Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were occupied by the Soviet Union, connecting Kaliningrad to Russia proper. The island, sometimes referred to as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, had to be protected with a very strong air force. Another very important factor that encouraged Sweden to expand this department of the army was the region next to the west coast, where American nuclear submarines were located in the early 1960s. A strong Swedish air force was necessary to keep Soviet anti-submarine aircraft from operating in the missile launch area. Around this time, its size was about 1,000 planes, the 4th largest in the world. With Finland, however, the situation is quite different. The primary purpose of its military is stopping a potential land invasion from the east. Since the Finnish defense forces are designed for, well, defense of Finland only, there's no real need to maintain a sizable army at all times. With a population of 5.5 million, it has 1.5 million men between the ages of 18 and 60 available for service. Women may also join the military, but voluntarily. The size of the regular army of Finland is just 23.8 thousand active personnel in peacetime, only 200 more than Sweden. During wartime, however, this number would be increased to 280,000, almost by a factor of 12. The size of the reserves is also staggering, 900,000 personnel. This army's equipment is also far different from that of Sweden. Apart from 239 German Leopard tanks and almost 1,200 armored vehicles, it has 800 artillery systems, 76 rocket launchers, 146 missile systems. You get the idea. There's a lot of land-based stuff. The Finnish Navy, though, doesn't have that many ships. Still, there are 4 corvettes, 8 missile boats, and over 100 small transport ships. The Air Force of Finland is just a bit smaller than that of Sweden, but is still by no means small at 164 operational aircraft, among which 55 are fighter jets. What's interesting about these numbers, though, is the origin of all this equipment. Sweden's possessions, apart from the tanks, are almost entirely produced domestically or in Finland. Finland itself has equipment from all around Europe, as well as the Soviet Union. One of the reasons for that is economics. The Swedish government could just be hesitant to increase its military spending because it's not that beneficial to the economy, unless it's investing in domestic production or for the benefit of its neighbor, the country that would most likely be attacked first in the case of a war with Russia. Finland, on the other hand, just needs the most modern stuff. It's cool to encourage domestic production, but not when you have better options and a neighbor with an unpredictable past. Another reason is, well, Finland just doesn't have a company like Saab. Its defense companies are dwarfed by the Swedish giant, and I'm not even going to compare them to what the US has. So, having bigger needs for equipment and smaller production capabilities, Finland just chooses to buy rather than to produce at home. Speaking of buying, surely these countries don't do much more than that to appear neutral in the eyes of everyone? Finland stayed almost completely neutral during the Cold War, apart from buying equipment from both the Warsaw Pact and NATO countries. In 1995, all of this changed when the country politically and economically allied with the West, joining the EU together with Sweden and Austria. Militarily, however, a shift in Finland's policy occurred as early as 1994, when it joined NATO's Partnership for Peace program. One Finnish battalion was sent to help NATO's peacekeeping mission in Bosnia in 1996, and since 1999, over 7,000 Finns have served in the KFOR operation in Kosovo. Finnish forces also worked alongside Allied forces in Afghanistan and then Iraq. A consensus about joining NATO was nowhere to be seen, but the membership option was kept on the table since as early as the mid-1990s. Gradually, Finland intensified its NATO collaboration and geared its defense forces towards full interoperability. In 2014, Russia took Crimea without asking. So a year later, Finland joined NATO's Enhanced Opportunities Partners program along with Sweden and 3 other nations. This Enhanced Opportunities Partners thing has never been given a real definition. So we have to think of it as an initiative which would offer specific benefits that are tailor-made to meet each of these 5 countries' interests. Sounds boring, and well, that's by design. It's more like saying, look, we're doing something productive but not provocative. It's just peace and friendship stuff. But because of bureaucracy, you won't understand much, as always. Nobody's joining NATO, you can move on with your lives, and Russia shouldn't worry either. Since 1991, Sweden was drifting away from neutrality almost identically to Finland. We'll not go through that again. What is worth covering, though, is Sweden's cooperation with the West during the Cold War. Initially, right after World War II ended, rulers of Sweden and Finland were expressing interest in creating a neutral alliance of North European countries. This idea was soon forgotten, as NATO was founded with Norway and Denmark being among the first 12 members. Therefore, Sweden maintained its neutrality policy, fearing that the Soviet Union might respond by invading Finland, which was definitely not favorable. This neutrality policy was nothing like Finlandization, though. In the late 1940s, Finland quietly tried to start an independent nuclear program, involving production of plutonium and acquisition of nuclear secrets from all nuclear powers. This initiative was scrapped as too costly. A nation with such a small budget and so little manpower simply could not compete with the nuclear powers. Similar thoughts about neutrality in general were often expressed. Sweden's leaders understood that, in a Third World War, neutral countries would be seen as easy prey rather than a party that the fighting powers would not care about. So there was a lot of cooperation between them and the US. In the late 1940s and early 50s, Sweden built very close ties to both NATO and the United States. It was deeply involved in Cold War spying operations, as well as secretly given security guarantees. The military cooperation also included providing much help with the development of the fighter jet Saab 37 Viggen, which is part of why Sweden's defense industry is doing much better than Finland's. Swedish scientists, in turn, helped enhance the accuracy of the Polaris nuclear missiles, And yes, these are the ones that were carried by submarines near the west coast of the country. They didn't just happen to be there because of Denmark and Norway. The US relied on Sweden to cover the airspace next to these submarines. And on top of that, every publicly available war games training included the scenario that if Sweden was under attack from the Soviets, it would rely on NATO forces for defense. That's some pretty strong cooperation. And knowing all of this, it's really hard to see Sweden as a neutral state. So a lot has been going on behind the scenes as ordinary people were thinking of Finland and Sweden as just neutral countries. Not many were aware that only one piece of the NATO membership puzzle was missing. And ironically, this last piece was the awareness itself. But it's never an easy task to make people agree on something that has been controversial for decades. On the scale of an entire nation, it might just be impossible to do it from the inside. Though at the start of 2022, this problem was about to get solved in an instant. Logically, Russia's next move was not that hard to predict. The buildup of forces was not fake, with field hospitals and all sorts of other military infrastructure being set up on the border. The propaganda campaign was in full swing. It wasn't hard to believe Russia would invade Ukraine again, but it was hard to believe that it would launch a full-scale invasion on Europe's doorstep. And so, quite unexpectedly, not only did Russia invade in one of the most violent ways imaginable, but Ukraine was ready to fight back. Our armed forces are here. The citizens are here. We are all here. Defending our independence, our country. It will remain like this. In April of 2022, the Russians withdrew from the north of Ukraine. They were stopped by a far less experienced military with far more limited equipment. For a lot of people, this put an end to the debate of whether NATO was necessary after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Not to mention, now that Russia is barely making any advances in Ukraine, it's not possible to launch yet another invasion into Finland. All of this means that now, the perfect opportunity to join NATO has emerged in front of the remaining non-allied Scandinavian nations. Shocking clips of atrocities done by the Russians, absurd claims and violent threats from the Russian state TV, stories of Ukrainian refugees, all of this changed the minds of millions of Finns and Swedes far better than any logical arguments could. The support for joining NATO skyrocketed in both Finland and Sweden. The fearful respect for the Russian armed forces just vaporized, as if it was never even there in the first place. It was replaced with memes about an army of uneducated marauders. Here's a clip of Finnish tractor drivers moving towards the eastern border. If the Russians invaded with their tanks, someone would have to tow them after they ran out of fuel, I guess. So, the public support for joining NATO is finally here. Awareness is not missing anymore. The puzzle is complete, and the next step can only be a formal application for NATO membership, which Finland and Sweden announced together on May 18th, 2022. One more request before moving on to part 2 of this video. If you enjoy videos like this, please consider supporting the video on Patreon. With YouTube's strict monetization requirement, a lot of my videos are restricted and demonetized. So all this is made possible mainly by the support of my patrons. So if you enjoy the videos, please check out my Patreon by clicking on the link in the description. For a lot of us, 2022 didn't start well. The world was only starting to recover from the pandemic, but not a lot of time was left before the start of a gruesome event that would make some people simply forget about COVID. While the common folk didn't believe in what was about to happen, those who knew were preparing to respond to the Russian invasion. This response was not limited to the immense fortitude of the Ukrainian army. It would be an understatement to say that the support Ukraine received from the West was unprecedented. But one act of solidarity stood out from the rest. It wasn't humanitarian aid, it wasn't a transfer of weapons, it wasn't even intended to be a gesture of support. And yet, the Ukrainians viewed it as one of the most inspiring and historic events of the century. You read the title. This event was Sweden and Finland's joint application for NATO membership. Yes, in retrospect, it sounds cool and epic, but it's taking a bit longer than the couple of months that some people expected from countries which would be pretty valuable to the alliance. So what happened? There are a few reasons why a country might have its NATO accession postponed. First, let's look at the minimum requirements for NATO membership. This is not the complete checklist, it's just a good baseline to start with. These 5 criteria are actually a piece of cake for Sweden and Finland. Look for yourself. Uphold democracy, including tolerance for diversity. I don't think there's much to say here. Check. Be progressing towards a market economy. Well, a lot of countries are looking up to the Nordic nations on this matter, so check. Have their military forces under firm civilian control. Yeah, also check. Be good neighbors and respect the sovereignty of other nations. Sweden and Finland don't even have any ongoing territorial disputes. There are the Åland Islands just to the southwest coast of Finland, which were disputed between, funnily enough, Finland and Sweden themselves over 100 years ago. The dispute was settled by the League of Nations in 1921, and the Swedish Prime Minister expressed their dissatisfaction with the conclusion, but also said Sweden would not use force to regain control over the islands. Now that a century has passed, this dispute is barely worth noting, so we can put a big ol' check mark here as well. And lastly, work towards interoperability with NATO forces. That's exactly what they've been doing for the last few decades, so check. But you might think that there's a 6th one. Keep the country's military budget at or above 2% of GDP. But it's more of a guideline than a requirement. In fact, only 10 of the 30 member states meet this target, and Iceland doesn't even have a military at all. For Finland and Sweden, though, it's one of the major considerations regarding their potential membership. If you are that close to the enemy of NATO, your army must be well-funded and be ready to defend against an invasion. Finland already meets this requirement, just like basically every possible requirement regarding military capabilities. Sweden, on the other hand, is having some problems with that. But it's nothing too major, since its government has already been steadily increasing its defense budget since 2018 and has the 2% goal in mind. So this requirement is also not the real problem. What actually stops the accession from happening is the stance of other countries. The first country that comes to mind here is Russia. It's not a member of NATO, so on the legal side, it has nothing to do with accepting new members. However, if Russia doesn't like the prospect of a neighboring country joining the alliance, then a mysteriously repetitive sequence of events tends to take place. A separatist movement emerges out of nowhere, tries to create a new country next to the Russian border, and later gets recognized by only Russia and their puppet states. It's already happened in Georgia, then in Ukraine, and it's unlikely that Finland would be eager to repeat this experience. So what do the Russians think of these North European countries joining NATO? Well, it turns out, nothing to be afraid of. In Putin's speech from June of 2022, he signaled that it's ultimately okay if they join, but if NATO deploys military infrastructure and soldiers there, Russia would be obliged to respond symmetrically. Other Russian officials often talked about serious military and political consequences. But it's clear that they would first need to deal with the serious consequences they created in Ukraine before moving on to any other nations. Anyway, this position seems pretty nice overall, even suspiciously nice. Maybe that's because Russia doesn't have that much bargaining power anymore, or maybe the Russians are just very confident that the current NATO members won't be able to agree and accept the new states. It looks like the second option has been successful, so far. So, all 30 current member states must accept the new countries into the alliance. As this video is being made, 28 of them have ratified the treaties in their parliaments. Only Hungary and Turkey haven't done this yet. So, about Turkey. There are a few things about the current situation in the country which you have to know to understand what's happening. 1. The presidential election is scheduled to take place on May 14th, 2023. 2. The current president, Mr. Erdogan, is not necessarily going to win. And 3. He has quite a lot of power in Turkey. All this means that it would be just strange if he didn't use this power to secure the third term. On top of that, Turkey wants to buy some American F-16 jets after getting their initial 2 purchases blocked because they ordered a Russian S-400 air defense system. However, these 2 reasons blend together very well, as the acquisition of F-16s would be a considerable diplomatic win for Erdogan. So the question of why Turkey hasn't accepted Finland's and Sweden's NATO ascension is now more about how Erdogan uses Finland and Sweden to win in this upcoming election. The answer to this question has a lot to do with how the opposition is structured. Erdogan's main rival in the election is a coalition of 6 parties with pretty various views. Despite being rather diverse, it agrees on supporting the ideas of strengthening the parliamentary system, the full guarantee of rule of law, separation of powers and human rights, and overall, moving in the direction of a more liberal democracy. This is largely why the coalition has gained as much popularity as it did. The other main reason is this man, Ekrem İmamoğlu. In 2019, he was elected as the mayor of Istanbul. He narrowly won the election by a margin of less than 14,000 votes, which is really nothing in a city of 15 million people. It would be an understatement to say that İmamoğlu took Istanbul by storm. Then, the election was annulled. But in the next one, İmamoğlu won again, now with a margin of over 800,000 votes. Shortly after, because of how quickly he gained popularity, he was called a possible candidate from the coalition for the 2023 presidential elections. Then, İmamoğlu was noticed by Erdogan. Noticed in a bad way. In January of 2022, İmamoğlu was put on trial for insulting electoral officials, and effectively banned him from competing in the upcoming elections. He called them fools for overturning the first Istanbul mayoral elections in 2019, which is apparently against Turkish law, but now he's appealing the conviction. No matter the results, İmamoğlu will not be able to participate in the 2023 elections. It's not the first time Turkish opposition leaders were thrown out of politics like this. The head of İmamoğlu's party in Istanbul, as well as the leader of the second biggest opposition party in Turkey, were also subject to this kind of prosecution. So we know for sure that Erdogan will take every opportunity to turn the elections in his favor. But what does this have to do with Finland and Sweden? Well, as you might already see, the biggest opposition coalition is generally centrist as opposed to Erdogan's right-leaning alliance. The third coalition, which is generally considered an underdog, is firmly left-wing. So that leaves Erdogan being the only major candidate on the right. So how about broadening the spectrum of voters and appealing to the far right as well? Basically, Erdogan is doing just that, while capitalizing off of national security threats by oppressing the Kurdish minority, which is not seen as a problem by the opposition. We won't get into the details of why, because there might be enough information there for an entire another video, but the main takeaway is that Finland and Sweden have contributed to the American-led intervention in Syria, supporting the Kurdish groups, with Sweden even supplying them with light anti-tank weapons. That did not go over well with Turkey, which has a goal of establishing a 30-kilometer buffer zone in the north of Syria. It would serve as a place where a considerable portion of Kurds could be resettled. This is not a first, because Turkey already controls a chunk of this zone after a 2019 invasion. This intention can also explain why reversing the F-16 ban would be a diplomatic win to Erdogan. But the Americans are not the only ones to have blocked arms exports to Turkey. Both Sweden and Finland have also stopped supplying weapons. They did it not because of the S-400 air defense system, but in response to the Turkish offensive in 2019, exactly the one mentioned before. So what did Erdogan initially want from Sweden and Finland? First, lift the arms embargo. Second, break any ties with Kurdish forces in Syria. And third, extradite a list of people that are allegedly connected with PKK, a Kurdish group that is recognized as a terrorist organization by both Turkey and the EU. To settle these disagreements, the countries signed a trilateral agreement. And as a result, the first 2 demands were actually no problem at all. But the third one put Sweden and Finland in a stalemate. It's not rare for Erdogan to erase opponents from politics, so quite expectedly, he put some people on the list for rather political reasons. Some of the cases have been blocked in court because of the following legal issues. An independent court has to review the cases, so politicians do not really have any power here. Citizens of neither Finland nor Sweden can be extradited. Yes, Erdogan really wants a couple of Finnish and Swedish citizens to be sent to Turkey. Politically incentivized extradition requests simply can't be fulfilled. And lastly, the alleged offenses must be also seen as crimes in Finland or Sweden. So you can't just extradite someone for insulting the Turkish president, even if that is technically illegal in Turkey. Among the so-called terrorists, there are a few blatantly political cases. There's a journalist who was given a suspended jail term for a tweet that said Erdogan's late mother would be ashamed of him. Also, there's a teacher who fled Turkey some 20 years ago, and now couldn't possibly have any ties with the PKK. It really looks like Erdogan just filled the list with people not connected to any terrorism just to make it look more impressive. Anyway, it looks like some progress has been made on this matter, and on the 29th of January, Erdogan said he might approve Finland's application. The Kurdish diaspora is a lot smaller in Finland, so Ankara's dispute with this country is less severe than the one with Sweden. The Finnish foreign minister, however, insisted on waiting to join the alliance together with Sweden. But the wait might get longer than anticipated. On the 21st of January, the Kurdish Democratic Society Center organized an anti-Islamic demonstration against Erdogan and joining NATO. The protest included jumping over a banner portraying the Turkish president, a puppet of Erdogan hanging by his feet, and a burnt copy of the Quran. This is going to be important later in the video. The protests were immediately condemned by Swedish officials, and its foreign minister said that an act of sabotage with respect to the ratification of Sweden's NATO membership. And, well, that's exactly what it was, considering that the Quran was burnt by a far-right pro-Russian extremist, and the demonstration overall was funded by a journalist with Kremlin ties. Turkish officials' reaction to this was rather strong, with Erdogan even saying that Sweden cannot join NATO as long as burning copies of the Quran is allowed, and quite interestingly, adding an additional 130 people to the extradition list. Sweden obviously will not change its laws just to fulfill this specific request, so the three countries agreed to take a timeout regarding NATO talks. However, the recent news tells us that the Swedish government is not going to helplessly watch people ruin the country's intention to join the alliance. On the 8th of February, Swedish police refused to permit a rally that would have included a burning of the Quran. It wasn't the same group of protesters as before, but still, I mean, what are they even hoping for? Did these people really think that burning a Quran twice a month was a good strategy to keep Sweden from joining NATO? Anyway, while this is a rare move by the police, it's definitely the right thing to do, especially considering just how much hostility the entire nation of Sweden received from Muslims because of a small group of Russian-funded extremists. Now back to Turkey. You might have some concerns of whether Erdogan is doing all of this to turn the situation in Russia's favor. In Ukraine, the local joke is that the morning of the average Ukrainian goes like this: wake up, eat your breakfast, brush your teeth, then read the news and check whose side Erdogan took today. For real though, if that were really the case, he would just focus a lot more on targeting Finland with the dilemmas that Sweden is facing right now. He's just doing that to win the upcoming election. There's not really much more to it than that. But what should we expect after the election? Will the winner allow Sweden and Finland to join NATO right away, or will we have to wait even longer? Well, the answer depends on who wins, because if it's the opposition, then it would definitely speed up the process. The opposing alliance does not have a strong anti-Kurdish stance, unlike the currently ruling coalition. It's also a lot more pro-European and pro-NATO. As for Erdogan, he could well approve of both Finland and Sweden joining the North Atlantic Alliance because of growing pressure from other European countries. Though he might have to wait a month or two to pretend that he didn't just use this whole situation to improve his approval ratings. And finally, this is Hungary. This is Viktor Orbán, the Prime Minister of Hungary. This is how many seats his party has in the country's parliament. And this is what he said after winning the election for the fourth consecutive time in May of 2022. You might see what the problem is already, but let's get into the details. Hungary is a part of both the EU and NATO, yet the policies and rhetoric of its government are not quite what you'd expect from one. Let's take a familiar example: the demonstration in Stockholm where a far-right pro-Russian guy burnt a Quran. How did the other alliance members react to this? Interestingly enough, no official statements on these events came from Albania, which is the only Muslim-majority country in NATO, apart from Turkey. Norway didn't permit a similar demonstration shortly after, due to a warning from the Turkish Foreign Ministry. Finland assured that it would not allow acts such as this as well, referring to the Finnish law where violating religious peace is a punishable offense. A German Foreign Ministry spokesperson said, "It was disrespectful and highly inappropriate, and we also doubt that this action represents the view of the majority of Swedish society." A US State Department spokesman said, "Something can be lawful but awful. What we've seen in the context of Sweden falls into that category," adding that the burning was the work of a provocateur who may have deliberately sought to put distance between two close partners of ours, Turkey and Sweden. He said it was repugnant, disgusting, and vile. But apparently, it was not enough for one of the Turkish media outlets, which went as far as contradicting itself in the title. US says Quran burning in Sweden disrespectful, but falls short of condemning it. When Russians burn copies of the Ukrainian constitution, Ukrainians just laugh and think of it as the terminal stage of coping. When someone burns the Bible, Christians don't care as much as to start worldwide protests. Still, given that the Quran is literally the centerpiece of the culture and society of Islam, it's very easy to understand how some Muslims can even mix up far-right extremists with regular Swedes, who certainly didn't ask for these Quran-burning demonstrations. However, there was one country that stood out from the rest. And you guessed it, it was Hungary. Hungary's foreign minister said, "If a country wants to join NATO and is endeavoring to win over Turkish support, then perhaps it should behave a little more carefully." Hungary stood out as the only country to shift the blame from extremists to the entire government. And it's not a coincidence. Turkey is one of Hungary's best political partners. In fact, Viktor Orban's first post-election visit in 2022 was to Erdogan. The country's officials also did not want to condemn Turkey's military operation in Syria in 2019. As well as that, Hungary has uncommonly good relations with Russia. Its dependence on Russian oil is one of, if not, the highest in Europe. In 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, Orban refused to sanction Russia, which continued in 2022, when he strongly opposed energy sanctions and hesitated to let Sweden and Finland in NATO. Now, it's quite easy to see why Hungary is sometimes called the Trojan horse in the EU and NATO. But what are the causes of these unconventional policies? Turns out, there's enough information for yet an entirely another video, so here's the short answer. First, Viktor Orban is a very influential figure. So in some cases, his political decisions are based on his own views. And these views are not what you'd expect from a European prime minister. Here's a couple of his quotes. "We do not want to become peoples of mixed race. Ukraine is a land of nobody. Hope for peace is named Donald Trump." And so on and so on. On top of that, there's the Eastern opening policy, which Orban started all the way back in 2010. It was supposed to boost the economy for Hungary by attracting investors from Asian countries. But in reality, it only tied the country to Chinese and Russian political interests. It is also the primary reason why Turkey and Hungary are close allies. A pretty reasonable question might arise at this point. Why wouldn't Hungary just leave the EU and NATO if it doesn't like the European policies this much? There really are talks about a possible hard exit, but it's not likely that we'll see it anytime soon. The official reasoning provided by Orban is that Hungary is severely dependent on trade in the EU. Well, Eastern opening is a failure, so he's right about this one. But apart from just trade, there's also direct funding from the EU budget. Hungary is the second biggest beneficiary of the EU, only behind Poland, which receives roughly half as much funding per capita. Polling shows that Hungarians think this funding is the best part about being an EU member. So it's important that even a decade of anti-European Orban propaganda is not enough to convince the people of quitting the Union. Naturally, when this funding stops, it's a big deal for Hungary. When the funding was blocked for the first time in April of 2022 due to the increasingly authoritarian policy of Orban's party, Hungary tried to show its power by blocking sanctions against Russia and weapons exports to Ukraine, and not accepting Sweden and Finland into NATO. The intent was to get the funding back without meeting the demands of the EU regarding rule of law, prevention of corruption, and other suggested reforms that would reverse some of Orban's questionable decisions. It seems that Hungary did have a partial success here. In December of last year, a deal was agreed upon. Previously, 7.5 billion euros in payouts were frozen. Now that number has been lowered to 6.3 billion euros. In exchange, Hungary approved an 18 billion euro aid package to Ukraine. To get the rest of the money, it would have to complete 27 anti-corruption and judicial independence reforms. But most importantly, to the topic of this video, the last time Hungary's officials mentioned Sweden and Finland's NATO application was in late January of this year, when its foreign minister reacted to the notorious Koran burning incident. Despite taking quite a strong position there, he mentioned that Hungary still has a clear standpoint on admitting the two new members into the alliance. Earlier, in late November 2022, Orban stated that he would accept Sweden and Finland's NATO applications at the legislators' first session in 2023, which was planned for mid-February.
China's hegemony, not only in Asia, but in the world, is ending. A lot of factors like the COVID pandemic and the Chinese Communist Party's own hostile foreign policies have contributed to the mix of the decline of the Chinese empire. One nation, however, has emerged as a beneficiary of China's woes and an accelerator of China's problems, rising to glory in the wake of China's burning ashes. That nation is none other than the Asian country of Vietnam.
Vietnam is emerging as a low-cost alternative to China.
The opportunity in Vietnam is huge.
Since November 2022, we see a huge amount of foreign investors coming back to the market.
With a plentiful workforce, the government opened its doors to high-tech companies, looking to bring them from China, where a worker's average salary is 3 times that of Vietnam.
When you consider the rating which Vietnam is on, it's a very attractive market for the long term.
Vietnam, which is one of 12 nations in the pact, is positioned to hugely benefit economically. The agreement could also loosen Vietnamese ties with China.
The world is now abandoning China as companies like Nike, Adidas, and Samsung are choosing Vietnam over China. It legitimately seems like China's day in the sun is over, and Vietnam's glory days are just beginning. In today's video, we will be going over exactly why this is happening and how Vietnam is checkmating China. We will discuss Vietnam's rise to power and the factors that have given it an edge over China in recent years. Lastly, we will discuss China's role in all of this, and if truly the great dragon of the East is down for the count, or if the world's media is rushing to make an early verdict on a battle that still has life in it. So without taking much time, let's get into it. As we do that, please take a second to like this video and drop a comment on the next topic you'd like us to cover. By liking the video, you can help push the ever-hostile YouTube algorithm in our favor. These videos take time and effort to make, so your response as a community means a lot to us, something we're grateful for. Okay? Now let's get to talking about Vietnam. We know some of you might be surprised to hear that Vietnam is well on its way to becoming a global economic giant, but to be fair, this was a long time coming. Vietnam has always been living in the shadows of other Asian nations like China and India, but that's not to say it hasn't been, if not more progressive with its economy. In the past 30 years alone, the nation has undergone a transformation, and poverty reduction has played a fundamental role in bringing the nation to where it is today. As reported by the World Bank, the poverty headcount in Vietnam fell from nearly 60% to 20.7% in the past 20 years. That is miraculous growth if nothing else. From within the shadows, it seems like Vietnam has quietly transitioned from being one of the poorest global economies to one of the fastest growing with room for even more growth. Let's trace this progress path now, shall we? Most people, especially here in the United States, are only familiar with Vietnam because of the Vietnam War that went on from 1954 to 1975. The war was a long, drawn-out conflict that pitted the communist government of North Vietnam and its allies in South Vietnam, known as the Viet Cong, against the government of South Vietnam and its principal ally, the United States. The war ended up being a proxy war between Russia and the US in what was almost an idealistic war, a battleground for the Cold War. Most Americans will remember it as a costly affair that showed the fighting spirit of the Vietnamese people, even against a superior power. Well, after the US military retreated from Vietnam in 1975, the country's economy experienced severe developmental issues, resulting from the inefficiencies of a centrally planned economy, residual war effects, and low productivity rates that made it import dependent. These issues stifled growth, making the Asian nations suffer economically on top of all the instability that came with decades of post-war fever. To add to that boiling mess of hot Cheetos, Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia in 1979 to remove the Khmer Rouge government complicated the economic woes the country was already suffering from by redirecting resources to the war effort. These are resources that the struggling nation could have used for its people, but no, they were being used to fund yet another war. As a result of this, Vietnam faced the wrath of the international community, which condemned such actions. In fact, the US went as far as to impose sanctions, a situation that only served to further collapse the Asian nation. All these economic deficiencies and global tensions resulted in Vietnam's economy being one of the poorest in Asia, with a GDP growth rate of 2.8% in 1985 and a 378% inflation rate in 1986. One could say that reaching this bottom barrel of poverty is what inspired change to come. This is because in 1986, the Vietnamese Communist Party, or VCP as we'll be referring to it, set out to transform its economy. We suppose they woke up one day and decided that enough was enough and that it was time for a change. The VCP then shifted the economy from a centrally planned model to one that utilized market forces to allocate resources. The reforms, popularly known as Deux Moi, encouraged private industry, recognized private land rights, and abolished collective farming. The main thrust of the Deux Moi was to promote a multi-sector economic system, emphasizing the state sector while encouraging the private sector. To achieve economic integration, the open door would be implemented gradually in order to stabilize the political and social situation. Deux Moi, in its early stages, was focused mainly on the removal of self-imposed barriers to progress and the utilization of various market-oriented measures, including liberalization of the domestic market, encouragement of foreign district investment and the private sector, and reduction in subsidies to state-owned enterprises. These changes, along with Vietnam's military withdrawal from Cambodia in 1989, set the country on a course toward one of the quickest and most impressive periods of economic development in world history, an achievement whose successes we are discussing now. In 1986, when the VCP first implemented these reforms, Vietnam was one of the poorest countries in the region, with a poverty rate above 70%. That means that over 70% of the nation's citizens were living in abject poverty. That's 1 in every 10 people. That is quite the number. However, by 2020, this rate had declined to 5%, as in 0.5 people for every 10. That is quite an improvement. Also, as a result of the reforms, Vietnam went from a country faced with perpetual food shortages to in 1989, for the first time, exporting 1.4 million tons of rice. It has since remained a rice exporter. In 2008, it exported 4.7 million tons, becoming the world's second largest rice exporter after Thailand. Indeed, Vietnam's exports were instrumental in stemming the threat of a severe international food crisis in early 2008. Vietnam hasn't looked back since, with it in 2022 being the third top rice exporter in the world. It's very clear to see that the VCP's reforms have had such an impact on the nation. Looking at the numbers, you can see that in the 2010s alone, over 10 million people were rescued from the jaws of poverty by these VCP reforms. In less than a 30-year period as well, the country's GDP per capita also increased nearly tenfold, from under $300 in the 1980s to $2,800 in 2020. Let's be honest, if the world was a classroom, Vietnam would definitely be getting the prize for the most improved student. A lot of factors over the years have contributed to Vietnam becoming what it is today, and all this has led to the nation becoming one of the best investment places of the new age. The small nation has become a key part of the global supply chain, for textiles becoming an alternative, in some cases a better one to nations like China and India. The manufacturing capabilities of Vietnam have been so great that footwear and textiles made up 18% of its exports in 2018, while electronics and electrical equipment made up 40%. This number has only risen, getting higher and higher over the years. As this number has risen, so has Vietnam's relevancy so far as manufacturing is involved. This relevancy has been so much so that major companies like Adidas, Nike, and Samsung, among many others, now have a manufacturing presence there. As a result of this, it is no surprise that Vietnam's foreign direct investment has grown over 200 times since 1986, from $40,000 in 1986 to around $15.8 billion in 2018. Meanwhile, its exports increased by 19% from 2020 to 2021 and have only grown higher to date. Vietnam's growth in the region is now directly affecting and competing with China, the world's current biggest manufacturing hub. Vietnam has been growing at a steady pace and in silence, with its own economic growth eclipsing China in relation to its own economy. That means that even though China still outpaces Vietnam by far, Vietnam's growth rate has been higher than China's and higher than any Asian nation overall. Take a look at this table of growth projections in Asia. Vietnam leads the pack while China's own growth is slowing down. There almost seems to be a direct inverse correlation to the success of Vietnam and the misfortunes of China. It seems that as China slows down and loses out on growth, Vietnam is growing and developing more. Is there a direct relation? Well, we think yes and no. Let us explain. Firstly, the yes part. An undeniable fact of the matter is that part of Vietnam's growth, a huge part of it, is due to the great power competition between the United States and China.
The rising tensions between the world's two most powerful countries, the United States and China.
Game on here. A trade war between the United States and China is here. It's real. At the stroke of midnight, the U.S. hit China with tariffs on $34 billion worth of goods.
A battle between China and the U.S. over the self-governing island nation could result in devastating mutual losses.
So we don't have trade, which we don't have anything near free trade with China. We've opened up our markets to the Chinese for 25 years. This is my point.
Tensions between China and the United States, as I mentioned, are running high. Their defense chiefs are in a war of words.
It's China's fault. And you know what? It's not Joe's fault that it came here either. It's China's fault.
You see, in the past couple of years, as the tension between the United States and China has grown, the Chinese Communist Party has taken a less business-friendly posture. American businesses operating within China have found themselves on the short end of the stick as they have faced tons of retaliatory measures from the Chinese government, almost as a punishment for the US government hostilities. Let us give you a simple example. After Micron, an American tech company, rebuffed a 2015 takeover attempt by a Chinese state-owned company, it watched with disbelief as its innovations were stolen and copied by a Chinese competitor, and its business was blocked from China. It is China's treatment of American companies like Micron that contributed to former US President Donald Trump's decision to unleash a punishing trade war with the world's second-largest economy, a fight he said would halt Beijing's use of unfair practices to undermine the United States. Another example is the Marriott Hotel incident, an incident that shows that China has and will retaliate against companies it is displeased with. After Marriott had referred to Taiwan as a separate country on its website, the Beijing government shut down its online reservation site in China for a week. The company then had to issue an apology in an attempt to rectify the matter. The chief executive, Arne Sorensen, wrote in a statement on the company's website saying, "Marriott International respects and supports the sovereignty and territorial integrity of China. We don't support anyone who subverts the sovereignty and territorial integrity of China, and we do not intend in any way to encourage or incite any such people or groups. We recognize the severity of the situation and sincerely apologize." These are all examples of how the Chinese government could easily and has been making life difficult for American companies. Things like slowing down the permitting process for new stores or imposing stiff fines for minor infractions have not been known to be foreign. Add to the mixture the harsh zero-COVID policies that China has been putting into place, and what we have left is nothing short of a horrible business environment for most companies, particularly US ones. This has left companies feeling limited, insecure, and seeking alternative supply chains in a bid to reduce risk if and when any disruptions occur. Perhaps it is no wonder then that in 2021 alone, more than 11,000 foreign firms canceled their company registration in China. That's a big number. Others like Apple, Samsung, and Hasbro, which have had significant and long-standing manufacturing operations in China, have decided to reduce their operations in the country. And you know who they turn to in all of this? Sweet, reliable Vietnam. All this makes us think that Vietnam is the sweet best friend who capitalizes when a toxic couple breaks up and then ends up getting the girl. You know, your typical rom-com plot. In this case, Vietnam got the US, or rather a good portion of the business that the US was giving China. Vietnam has really benefited as major companies have moved their manufacturing there to take advantage of the low costs, developed infrastructure, supportive business environment, and success in mitigating the economic effects of COVID-19. For instance, Foxconn, the prominent electronic manufacturer that contracts with all major technology companies, including the behemoth Apple, announced it would invest $300 million in a new factory in northern Vietnam. Another giant, Google, has announced recently that it plans to ship as much as half of the production of its Pixel phones to Vietnam, while Microsoft has utilized Vietnam for some of its Xbox production. A few years ago, these corporations would have exclusively produced these items in China, but now, Vietnam is getting a big piece of the cake. The fact that these companies are also investing in factories and the like in Vietnam means that this is not a fad, but a long-term commitment that will only serve to benefit Vietnam more as the years progress. The Asian nation's growth, however, had not just been due to the US-China trade deficiencies. There have been other pull factors that have made Vietnam an attractive choice. Let's get into those, shall we?
Smartphones and other gadgets are manufactured in China these days. But what about Vietnam?
Vietnam's economy jumped by 8% this year.
The PVHs, even the Adidases and the Columbia sportswears, they've all sourced product out of Vietnam, and they have been doing that for years.
It's emerging as an alternative to China with its tax incentives and cheaper workforce.
The U.S. is importing 40% more from Vietnam than this time last year, while imports from China down 13%.
Okay. We've warmed you up on the successes of Vietnam. So we know you're asking yourself now, saying, how did this growth miracle happen? Other than the opportunistic approach it took with the US-China trade war, Vietnam has had other factors accelerate its growth. Analysts from the World Bank think that the nation's entire growth can be condensed together into three main factors we're about to dive into right now. The first of these factors is the simple fact that due to the VCP's policies, Vietnam has thoroughly embraced trade liberalization with gusto, with 95% of Vietnamese people agreeing to say that trade is good in a 2014 Pew Research survey. It makes sense that the people think so, because trade and globalization have been incredibly good for the nation. Vietnam's exceptionally globalized economy is a result of its focus on exports for economic growth. Over the past 20 years, Vietnam has signed numerous free trade agreements in order to become a contender on the global stage. In 1995, Vietnam joined the ASEAN Free Trade Area. In 2000, it signed a free trade agreement with the US, and in 2007, it joined the World Trade Organization. Since then, further ASEAN agreements followed with China, India, Japan, and Korea, and recently the amended Trans-Pacific Partnership went into effect. These agreements were made with the hope of gradually lowering the tariffs imposed on both imports and exports to and from Vietnam, thereby making it more trade-friendly, and making the trading itself cheaper to do. Suffice it to say, this has worked out quite well. Like China before it, Vietnam has opened up its cheap labor market to foreign investors and become a hub for low-cost manufacturing. The country is now a major exporter of electronics and apparel, with the United States and China as the main destinations for its goods. In order to make those goods, Vietnam is a major importer of machine parts and natural resources from South Korea and China. All of this has seen Vietnam's GDP per person grow from about $1,500 in 1990 to about $6,500 today. Quite the significant rise if we do say so ourselves. Also, unlike in some fast-growing economies, its new prosperity has been shared in the nation. The proportion of people in extreme poverty fell from above 70% in the early 1990s to around 10% in 2016. The World Bank credited the jobs created by Vietnam's export sector for this remarkable poverty reduction in a recent report. Perhaps most importantly, the economic growth was fairly inclusive. According to the World Economic Forum's Inclusive Development Index, Vietnam is part of a group of economies that have done particularly well at making their growth processes more inclusive and sustainable. Women, too, fared better. Their employment rate is within 10% of that of men, notes the World Bank, and women-led households are less likely than those by men to be poor, although inequalities remain. That's the kind of growth that's admirable. Oddly enough, even as Vietnam is checkmating China by taking business from them, data from the General Department of Customs shows that in 2022, China was Vietnam's largest trading partner with a total two-way trade turnover of $175.57 billion. This is a lot of trade being had there. This was followed by the US, who had $123.86 billion, the Republic of Korea, who had $86.38 billion, and Japan, who had $47.61 billion, all worth of trade. Trade between Vietnam and the US has been particularly good, with Vietnam being one of the top 10 largest goods trading partners of the United States. The total two-way trade value of goods in 2020 with the US was $89.5 billion. Goods exports to Vietnam from the US totaled $9.9 billion, while goods imports from Vietnam totaled $79.6 billion. This figure has only risen with time, as in 2021, Vietnam exported $99.3 billion to the United States. The main products exported from Vietnam to the United States were broadcasting equipment $17.4 billion, other furniture $6.23 billion, and seats worth $4.53 billion, among other things. Don't find these objects surprising. It's simply what the US mostly imports from Vietnam. In fact, in the past month, the top 3 US imports from Vietnam, also by value, were cell phones, related equipment, computers, and furniture parts. We had to mention that for those of you who might have been surprised that the US imports furniture and seats. In 2022, the total two-way trade value between the nations was, as we mentioned a second ago, $123.86 billion. We emphasize this to show you just how much these trade figures keep going up as trade between the two nations keeps improving year after year. So yes, we think it is quite safe to say that trade and globalization has been an important tool that Vietnam has managed to use in its favor. The second factor that Vietnam has going for it is that through its own domestic policies and extensive reforms, the nation has managed to put in place business-friendly regulations, all while lowering the cost of doing business in the nation. While trying to make foreign-friendly policy, the government's drive towards an open economy also included domestic reforms that targeted matters of governance from the inside. In 1986, the country created its first law on foreign investment, enabling foreign companies to enter Vietnam. Since then, law firm Baker & McKenzie said in a 2016 report, the law has been revised a number of times, mainly to adopt a more pro-investor approach while aiming to reduce administrative bureaucracy and better facilitate foreign investment into Vietnam. This has worked, seeing as that the foreign direct investment in Vietnam averaged $7.29 billion from 1991 until 2023, reaching an all-time high of $27.72 billion in December of 2022. These were astonishing figures, and of course, they did not go unnoticed in international rankings. In the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Report, Vietnam rose from 77th place in 2006 to 55th in 2017. In the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business rankings, meanwhile, Vietnam rose from 104th place in 2007 to 68th place in 2017. Last year, the bank said, Vietnam made progress on everything from enforcing contracts, increasing access to credit and electricity, paying taxes, and trading across borders. That's quite an achievement to make, and that is all thanks to Vietnam's own domestic reforms. Finally, the last factor that has contributed to the nation being where it is today is the fact that Vietnam has invested heavily in human and physical capital, predominantly through public investments. The Asian nation has truly invested a lot in its human capital and infrastructure. Facing a rapidly growing population, one that stands at just under 99 million today, half of whom are under 35 and up from 60 million in 1986, Vietnam made large public investments in primary education. This was necessary as a growing population also means a growing need for jobs. In addition to this, Vietnam also invested heavily in infrastructure, ensuring cheap mass access to the internet. This might sound minor, but with the Fourth Industrial Revolution knocking on Southeast Asia's door, having a sound IT infrastructure in place is essential preparation. At the end of the day, looking at Vietnam, one can see that those investments have paid off. Armed with the necessary infrastructure and market-friendly policies in place, Vietnam became a hub for foreign investment and manufacturing in Southeast Asia. Japanese and Korean electronics companies like Samsung, LG, Olympus, Pioneer, and countless European and American apparel makers have set up shop in the country, only serving to increase the nation's economic benefit. In fact, due to the infrastructure and labor investments in the nation, Vietnam is the 4th largest textile exporter in the world. That's quite the achievement for such a small nation. The amount of their exports is estimated to be over $38 billion. Specialization, modernization, and the manufacture of high-quality products are their primary goals to compete in this competitive market, and it definitely is working out for them. The nation's textile industry is made up of the downstream sector, fiber production, and upstream garment manufacturing. Growing garment exports to the United States, Japan, the European Union, and South Korea are a significant component fueling the expansion of Vietnam's textile sector as it keeps growing. It will be no surprise to see Vietnam directly rivaling China in the textiles industry in the years to come, as the company is on what can only be described as an unbelievable growth spurt. These three factors have collectively led Vietnam's GDP growth to increase, with it being at least 5% per year, and just last year, it peaked at a whopping 8%. This is in stark comparison to China, which grew from just 2.99%, its lowest since 1990. Just looking at this graph of Vietnam's GDP growth shows a tale of nothing but progress and increase. With such rapid economic growth over the years, the country has grown from one of the poorest countries in the world to a comfortably middle-income one. So, all this said, is there anything that can stop Vietnam from checkmating China? Despite all the high praise that we carry for Vietnam, the nation still faces severe hurdles to future growth. Perhaps the most important and the most limiting factor to the nation's ability to properly checkmate China is the country's population size. Quite frankly, it will never amount to more than a fraction of China's. You see, Vietnam is slightly less populous than China's southern Guangdong province, the birthplace of Chinese special economic zones in 1979, and still a key component in its manufacturing. Foxconn even had its flagship campus in Guangdong, while Chinese tech giants Huawei and ZTE are headquartered there. These companies are centralized there mainly because of the province's easy access to Hong Kong and coastal ports and access to the Chinese labor pool. Vietnam, on the other hand, has none of the benefits that come with being a province of a vast, economically diversified nation with the world's largest workforce. That's where they start to lag behind. According to a Beijing national census conducted in 2010, around one-third of Guangdong's population of 104 million were migrants from elsewhere in China. While Vietnam's rural population of around 65% certainly leaves room for urban migration to bolster manufacturing, the country lacks China's hundreds of millions of people ready to travel to fill positions as they arise. The factories in the Pearl River Delta churning out iPhones and Nike sneakers can rely on a steady stream of migrants from across China to man the assembly lines, while Vietnam has only itself to turn to. With a small population, what this means is that as the growth intensifies, Vietnam might not be able to keep up with demand based on the simple fact that it will run out of labor. This puts a cap on the level of growth they can experience. In addition to this, in comparison to China, Vietnam's workforce is relatively low-skilled, and its energy supply is having a hard time keeping up with demand. And although the country has made significant advances in infrastructure development, it still ranks 47th out of 160 countries in this regard. That's yet another setback to Vietnam's plan to checkmate China. We know that some of you are asking yourself, other than labor shortfalls, can anything stop Vietnam's ascent to the top of the Asian food chain? Well, just like with most things, yes and no. With the appetite for globalization on the wane in many parts of the country, Vietnam looks particularly vulnerable, and with good reason. Vietnam's exports are worth 99.2% of its GDP. Yes, 99.2%. Just to further clarify that figure, what we're saying is that Vietnam's whole economy is basically based on foreign investment and trade. If anything at all were to hinder supply chain movements, or if the foreign policy of its top trading partners shifted against it, Vietnam would be stuck in some very hot and unpleasant soup. This is a real possibility given how geopolitics and the political economic landscape are always shifting. However, for now, Vietnam looks to profit from rather than be hurt by increasing global trade tensions that constantly rock our fragile world. Despite Vietnam making ground on China's economic territory, the truth of the matter is, China's advanced supply chain and supplier network, driven by the government's long-term national policies, make it a manufacturing giant. At present, no one country, including Vietnam itself, can fully replace China's manufacturing capacity. Let's take a moment to assume that in some way, Vietnam could bridge this gap and replace the Dragon of the East. Even if this were possible, it most certainly would not happen overnight. This is a process that will take time as businesses figure out which parts to relocate and how to navigate those waters. It will likely be messy to begin with, but processes will get easier over time if they were to happen at all. So you see, it's a yes and no situation. Looking inward, Vietnam's government has been pushing to move from being a low-tech manufacturer to high-tech manufacturing. Recent investments from Intel, Samsung, and UAC show that there is immense potential in the country. And while it is safe to say that Vietnam can't absorb all of China's manufacturing, it is well positioned to take on more production, along with other countries in the region, and to play an important role in global value chains. We believe the best way to tell the tale of this Asian country is in this one statement: Vietnam is growing at its own pace and its own way. Whether it will truly eclipse China or not is something that time will tell.
Russian president has launched a major
full-scale invasion.
Military trucks and tanks were seen moving into the city with white-painted Z signs on
full-scale nation at war.
Explosions around the capital.
Sudden as it was brutal and relentless.
Having to fight on the front line. They've gone from being civilians to now being soldiers.
Vladimir Putin warning other countries that any attempt to interfere with the Russian action will lead to, quote, consequences they have never seen.
A year ago, Russia invaded Ukraine. You probably remember watching this unfold on live television. At the time, the invasion didn't come as a complete surprise. For months, Russia was suspiciously building up troops along the border of Ukraine. At first, Russia denied that it was going to invade its neighbor, but we all know how that went. On the 24th of February, 2022, President Vladimir Putin gave the starting sign for what he called his special military operation. Fast forward to 2023, and Ukraine is still fighting off this Russian invasion. You won't be surprised to hear that a lot has changed for both Russia and Ukraine in the past year. But one thing has stayed the same. This war is still very relevant. To this day, the war is making headlines all over the world. There's one reason for this relevancy, and in this video, I'll explore how the Ukraine war began in the first place and why it's more relevant than ever. As you'll see later, this war has become an unofficial conflict between the United States and Russia. By the way, if you can, please help out in my war against the dislike bots, and please hit the like button below. It helps the video out tremendously against the algorithm, and in return, here's a funny meme for you.
President Boris Yeltsin today recognized the independence of two Baltic states, Latvia and Estonia, and the second largest Soviet republic, the Ukraine, today declared its independence.
Let's go back to 1991. This was a very important year for Ukraine. In 1991, the Soviet Union fell, and Ukraine gained its independence. For decades, Ukraine had been a part of the Soviet bloc. In the eyes of the West, the Soviet Union was the evil empire. Ukraine was an important part of this. It was one of the 4 founding members of the Soviet Union. After Ukraine gained its independence, it had an important choice to make. One option was to leave Soviet times behind and form an alliance with the West. This is what some other former Soviet states did, as some joined the NATO alliance and the European Union. The Baltic states are an example of this. Ukraine's other choice was to continue working together with its former Soviet partner, Russia. You can understand why this was a divisive topic in Ukrainian politics. Some Ukrainians were pro-Western, while others were in favor of a relationship with Russia. The 2004 presidential election results showed a clear division. You had Viktor Yanukovych on the one side and Viktor Yushchenko on the other. Even though their names sound really similar, they had totally different opinions. Viktor Yanukovych was aligned with Vladimir Putin and wanted to cooperate with Russia, but Viktor Yushchenko wanted to join the European Union. Viktor Yanukovych won the election with a small majority, but the election result was kinda shady. Some international organizations said that the election was rigged. The opposition was angry about this election fraud and went to the streets. You may have heard about these events under the name of the Orange Revolution.
Hundreds of thousands of pro-democracy Ukrainians in the streets today protested against the results of the presidential election.
The protests were effective. Eventually, the Supreme Court of Ukraine ruled that the election results were falsified. In the new election that followed, the other pro-Western Viktor won. As you can imagine, Putin, he wasn't too happy about that. The new Ukrainian president was choosing the West over Russia and seeking EU membership. Russia thought that the US Special Services were behind the Orange Revolution. This resulted in a lot of tensions between Ukraine and Russia. The 2005 gas disputes are a pretty good example of this. Back in 2005, tons of Russian state-owned gas pipelines went through Ukraine. Russia accused Ukraine of stealing natural gas from these pipelines and not paying for it. Russia went as far as to temporarily cut off gas supply to its neighbors in 2006. Russia and Ukraine didn't have a good relationship, to put it mildly. However, much of these tensions cooled down after the 2010 presidential election. Viktor Yanukovych became president of Ukraine once again. He shifted Ukraine's policy from pro-Western to pro-Russian. Western countries criticized his government for having a controlled democracy as he cracked down on his opposition. In 2011, he sentenced his main political rival, Yulia Tymoshenko, to prison. This sentence was likely politically motivated. The arrest caused some protests in Ukraine, but nothing like what was about to come. In 2013, President Yanukovych made a bold move. He suddenly chose not to sign an important agreement with the European Union. This association agreement was supposed to deepen Ukraine's ties with the EU. For many Ukrainians in support of the European Union, this was the last straw. In 2013, They went out on the streets to protest once again. These protests resulted in the Revolution of Dignity, also known as the Euromaidan. They were the biggest protests in Ukraine since the Orange Revolution in 2004. From the end of 2013 to the beginning of 2014, several uprisings happened in major Ukrainian cities. Protesters took over government buildings and clashed with the police. The special forces opened fire on these protesters, resulting in 103 deaths. These casualties are now called the Heavenly Hundred. Just like the Orange Revolution, the Euromaidan was effective. The Ukrainian parliament removed Yanukovych from his office on the 22nd of February 2014. The former Ukrainian president quickly fled to Russia. Moscow saw this revolution as an illegitimate coup caused by outside factors. The Euromaidan, along with the Orange Revolution, were the starting point for a lot of the tensions between Russia and Ukraine. As it happens, the events of 2014 had a bit of a snowball effect.
With the stroke of a pen, Russia defied protesters in Kiev, minorities in Crimea, and leaders across the Western world.
Celebrating leaving Ukraine and joining Russia. The city of Simferopol in Crimea, where thousands of people have been rejoicing in Moscow's annexation of the Black Sea Peninsula.
After signing the treaty, Putin greeted supporters in Moscow's Red Square, saying Crimea was returning home.
In February and March of 2014, Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula. Before the annexation, Crimea was an autonomous republic within Ukraine. The fact that the annexation happened just after the Euromaidan protests, it's no coincidence. The correlation between the two has to do with what Putin was thinking. On the night after Yanukovych was ousted by parliament, Putin held an all-night meeting with his security advisors. He was afraid that the new Ukrainian government would turn against Russia. Crimea in particular was an important point for discussion. Putin came to the conclusion that we must start working on returning Crimea to Russia. But why Crimea in particular? There are a couple of reasons for this decision. The majority of the Crimean population is ethnically Russian, which means that their ancestry and culture can be traced back to Russia. Most people in Crimea speak Russian instead of Ukrainian. These facts have to do with Crimea's history. For more than 100 years, Crimea was a part of Russia. In 1783, it was taken in by the Russian Empire. Later, Crimea became an autonomous part of the Russian Soviet Republic. But in 1954, the Soviet Union decided to transfer Crimea to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. Back then, it didn't really matter all that much. The Russian and Ukrainian Soviet republics were both parts of the Soviet Union. But when the Soviet Union fell, this transfer had some big consequences. Crimea is now rightfully a part of Ukraine. Putin still thinks that this 1954 transfer was unfair. However, Putin's reasons weren't only historical or cultural. Crimea is a very strategic asset because it has access to the Black Sea. This is important for both Russian commerce and the Russian Navy. Now, these reasons don't justify breaking international law, of course, but for Putin, it was enough to move his troops in. At the beginning of 2014, Russian soldiers crossed into Ukrainian territory. These Russian troops were called Little Green Men because they were disguised in unmarked green uniforms. They took over government buildings and blocked the access points to the Ukrainian mainland. There wasn't really much resistance in Crimea, which allowed Russia to take it over quickly. In March, Putin held a referendum on joining the Russian Federation. 97% voted in favor of this, according to Russia. This referendum result wasn't legitimate, as Russia wasn't allowed to hold it in the first place. However, an independent US government survey showed that 74% of Crimeans believed life would be better when they joined Russia. The 97% figure? It's unrealistic. But the end result was still likely a majority. On March 18, 2014, Crimea was officially incorporated into the Russian Federation. The Crimean annexation was the starting point of the Russo-Ukraine War. However, Crimea wasn't the only part of Ukraine that Putin targeted. Russia began to support tons of separatist groups in the east of the country. In these parts of Ukraine, there's an ethnic Russian minority, and especially in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, fighting was fierce. Separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk wanted to create their own republics, which Russia supported. You see, the soldiers fighting for these republics weren't just Ukrainian separatists. Just like in Crimea, Russia sent disguised soldiers. The situation in 2014 got very tense when these separatists threatened to take over Mariupol, but eventually the conflict cooled down. Around 2015, the fighting in eastern Ukraine got less intense. Ukraine, Russia, and the separatist groups signed the Minsk agreements. These agreements stopped most of the heavy fighting by establishing a buffer zone. Both sides began to fortify their positions by digging trenches, which changed the combat into trench warfare. The state of trench warfare in eastern Ukraine continued for several years. The slow war in eastern Ukraine became irrelevant in most countries, as the situation didn't really change all that much. But in Moscow, plans were being drawn to radically change this status quo. From March to April of 2021, Russia began a large-scale military buildup near the border. Putin mobilized thousands of troops in the largest mobilization since the annexation of Crimea. Satellite imagery showed that Russia was piling up military equipment near the border and building up military infrastructure. People were scared that an invasion was imminent. We know now that they were right, but this invasion didn't happen immediately. In June of 2021, Russia called many of its troops back. Maybe this invasion thing won't happen after all, you might think. But Putin didn't change his mind about his invasion plans. The first buildup was nothing yet. Starting in October of 2021, Russia had an even bigger buildup along the border. About 100,000 Russian troops were stationed next to Ukraine by December. Newer satellite footage showed that Russia wasn't up to anything good. Russia was resuming the buildup it started months earlier. Kyiv and its allies started to get real nervous at this point. President Joe Biden said in a press conference that he expected Russia to attack Ukraine. Russia initially denied these allegations, but a month later, Biden was proven right.
Трагическим событиям, происходящим на Донбассе, и ключевым вопросом обеспечения безопасности самой России. Начну с того, о чем говорил в своем обращении от 21 февраля текущего года. Речь о том, что вызывает у нас особую озабоченность и тревогу. О тех фундаментальных угрозах.
Of what Russia is calling a special military operation.
Russian military vehicles moving in the Kherson region.
Military trucks also seen heading north from Crimea.
Trucks and tanks.
Armored personnel carriers and other military vehicles cross the border from Belarus into Ukraine.
With white painted Z signs.
And tanks roll through the cities, including Sumy.
On the early morning of February 24th, Putin announced the start of the invasion on live television. Putin said in his speech that a special military operation was needed to defend Russia. The Russian military would demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Minutes after the speech, airstrikes hit cities across Ukraine. The Russian military began to move into Ukrainian territory. It was clear the long-awaited Russian invasion had begun. A lot has happened since then. For months on end, an endless stream of information came from the front lines. To keep it simple, military analysts had divided these months into 4 different stages. The first unpredictable weeks of the invasion are called the first phase of the war. Of course, Russia had thought out a strategy for these initial days. The Russian military would overwhelm Ukraine, take Kyiv, and install a pro-Russian government. Pretty simple, right? Apparently, Putin thought that the Russian military could pull this off. After all, you only start a war when you think you're gonna win. But we all know that it went a whole lot differently. A few hours after Putin's speech, Russia attacked from all sides. Putin wanted to overwhelm Ukraine's defenses with this. Belarus in the north, Donetsk in the east, and Crimea to the south were the main points of the attack. But as the days went by, cracks started to show in this Russian strategy. The Russian military failed to achieve full air superiority, which is well needed if you want to send your troops in. And to Putin's unpleasant surprise, the Ukrainian resistance was much stronger than he expected. residents of Kyiv took up arms and prepared Molotov cocktails for the Russian troops. The Russians didn't receive a warm welcome, to say the least. Russia's military tried to encircle Kyiv and take it over, but they failed. Ukraine quickly pushed the Russian troops away from Kyiv. Clearly, something went wrong in this initial phase for Moscow. Russia assumed superiority, which it didn't have, and the Russian strategic planners weren't the only ones who got this assumption wrong. US intelligence officials thought that Kyiv would be taken within 96 hours. We all know that they got this wrong by already a year at this point. The reason for this mistake is obvious. Russia's military was weaker than expected, and Ukraine's military, stronger. The failed Russian Kyiv convoy is a pretty good example of this. Russia prepared a 40-mile-long convoy which was headed for Kyiv. The convoy had tons of military vehicles and held an estimated 15,000 troops. This was an integral component of Russia's invasion plans. Putin needed this convoy to take over Kyiv. The thing is, though, it never arrived in Kyiv. In March, the convoy stalled. We don't know the exact reason for this. It could have to do with bad planning, food or fuel shortages, or even Ukrainian counterattacks. One thing seems clear, though. The Russian military couldn't achieve what Putin wanted. Ukraine could defend Kyiv, and the Ukrainian government remained in power. But Putin was already pretty deep into this war, and he couldn't stop this special military operation he had just begun. That's why he changed his strategy during the next phase of the conflict. The second phase of the war started in April of 2022. Putin had to tone down his expectations and focus on smaller areas. So Russia started focusing on southern and eastern Ukraine. These regions of Ukraine were the most obvious places to attack. Remember the 2004 election results we talked about earlier? This map should explain things a bit. The southeast of Ukraine voted mainly for Viktor Yanukovych, while the northwest voted mostly for Viktor Yushchenko. There's a clear divide between these two parts of Ukraine. The southeast wanted close ties with Russia, while the northwest wanted close ties with the EU. Since 2014, this has obviously changed a lot. After the war began, the opinion on Russia has just deteriorated. The people in southeastern Ukraine are obviously not in favor of war, but because of the 2014 election results, Putin had a better chance in the southeast than in the northwest. This is why the second phase was mostly fought out in the southeast. Apart from the front line, the Russian military tactics have also changed. The swift attacks from the first phase changed into slow and prolonged defenses. But this new tactic wasn't going smoothly. The Russian military wasn't making any progress in the second stage of the war. Basically, Ukraine and Russia were locked into a stalemate. For Ukraine and its allies, this was good news. Ukraine was putting up a fight against Russia, and it was able to fend off Russia's attacks. But in order to do this for a long period, Ukraine needed military aid from its allies. NATO realized this and started ramping up military support for its ally. The United States gave billions of dollars worth of military aid, and other NATO countries did the same. This military support has had huge effects on the rest of the war, as we'll discuss later. Now to the third phase of the conflict. In September, Ukraine regained lots of territories from the east near Kharkiv. As you all probably know, this counteroffensive brought Putin big trouble. For Putin, starting the war is one thing, but losing the war he started was not an option. With such a failure, Putin would lose all credibility at home. So he chose the second worst option, a partial mobilization. On September 21st, Putin called up 300,000 Russian men to fight. According to Putin, this was necessary because Russia was at war with the collective West. Many Russians didn't like this draft, though. Hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens have left after the mobilization. Forbes reported the number could be as high as 700,000 people. Apart from this draft, Putin had other plans to stop Ukraine's advance. In October, Russia began massive bombing rounds on Ukraine's infrastructure. This strategy didn't destroy all of Ukraine's infrastructure, as the US had already deployed air defensive equipment to Ukraine. You could say that the bombing rounds were counter-effective. After these airstrikes, NATO only sent more defensive equipment to Ukraine. The third phase ended with Russia withdrawing from Kherson in November, a major city in Ukraine's south. The Russian army drew back its forces to the Dnipro River, which was another victory for Ukraine. The third phase went relatively well for Ukraine. Ukrainian soldiers liberated some territories in the south and the east, but this didn't continue in the fourth phase of the war, which started after the Kherson counteroffensive. Just like in Phase 2, Ukraine and Russia became locked into another stalemate. Russia achieved some small advances, but nothing much. The biggest capture was the town of Soledar, a relatively small city in eastern Ukraine. Unsurprisingly, the front line didn't move much in this new stage. But it's not like the war didn't change at all in Phase 4. Talking about wars, it's a very risky move covering controversial topics like invasions on YouTube. I often have to blur footage or cut out parts altogether to make sure my videos don't get restricted. That's why I launched my own newsletter, where every week I cover important world news and send it directly to your email. You can sign up now by clicking on the link in the description, and best of all, it's completely free.
Western weapons, including German-made Leopard tanks, due to arrive soon.
For months, he's campaigned for these, in public and intensely behind the scenes diplomatically. Now, Ukraine's leader is going to get this powerful, reliable, and potentially transformative bit of kit.
Kyiv's forces are training to maneuver, load ammunition, and maintain Western military vehicles, ahead of their delivery to the battlefield, which the UK says could be weeks away.
NATO is going to send tanks to Ukraine. Now, at first, that doesn't seem very special. The NATO alliance has sent billions of dollars worth of military aid to Ukraine already. So why not send tanks as well? But sending tanks is a huge shift in NATO policy. Most of the military support for Ukraine was meant to defend it against Russian attacks. Things like air defense systems or anti-tank weapons have tremendously improved Ukraine's defense capabilities. But tanks definitely fall out of this category. Ukraine wants to use them in a new counteroffensive. Tanks could help Ukraine push Russian troops out of Ukrainian territory. No problem, right? Ukraine has the right to take back the land Russia illegally snatched away, but it isn't as simple as it seems. Zelensky wants the border back to where it was before the Russian invasion. The thing is, though, Putin, he's not going to allow that to happen. Russia has spent billions of dollars on the war already. If Putin loses his captured territories, all his money will be spent in vain. And don't forget that tens of thousands of Russian soldiers have already died in this battle. Putin can't back off after he's spent taxpayer money and lost troops. He needs something to show for his special military operation in Ukraine. If Ukraine launches a successful counteroffensive, Putin will do anything to stop it. That's why sending tanks could escalate this war even further. But again, I'm not saying that Ukraine shouldn't take back its territories. It has the right to do so. But the fact is, Putin will do everything to prevent that from happening. If you think about it this way, the war is now even scarier than it was in the beginning. At first, NATO was defending Ukraine against the Russian invasion. But now, NATO and Russia are indirectly at war with each other.
A dictator bent on rebuilding an empire will never be able to ease the people's love of liberty. Brutality will never grind down the will of the free. And Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia. Never.
Joe Biden wants Russia to lose this war. This doesn't stay at words. The Biden administration has sent more than $75 billion worth of support to Ukraine. It's obvious that the US is fully invested in a Ukrainian victory. The United States wants Ukraine to get its territories back. But, as we've discussed earlier, Putin won't allow this to happen. It's safe to say that the United States and Russia have conflicting interests here. And the way they're solving this right now is through armed conflict. Of course, the US isn't directly involved in this, but through military aid, America is entangled in this war indirectly. Depending on how you define a war, solving conflicting interests through supporting an armed conflict comes pretty close. This is important to realize in the second year of the war. Russia is indirectly facing the US and our allies. And the stats are looking pretty bad for Putin. Combined, the NATO alliance is spending a mind-blowing $1.2 trillion a year on its military. Russia's $84 billion seems like nothing to that in comparison. The NATO alliance could just send billions of dollars worth of military support, which would force Russia to give up its territories. It's a good plan, right? Well, it's not going to be that simple. Putin has already compared this war against the West with the war against Nazi Germany. At a World War II memorial, Putin said that again and again we are forced to repel the aggression of the collective West. Back in World War II, the Soviets had a brutal tactic. They would fight a war of attrition as long as necessary. They would just rein in troops until the enemy was defeated. The Soviet Union won, but at a great cost. The death toll was between 20 and 27 million. And that uncertainty of 7 million people says it all. More than anything, Putin's historical comparison tells us that he won't give up easily. As long as Putin remains in power, he will fight a war of attrition, just like the Soviets did. But with NATO sending more and more sophisticated weapons to Ukraine, this war of attrition will get harder and harder for Putin. So then the question becomes, how long can Putin keep on fighting? To fight a war of attrition, you certainly need a firm grip on power. If the Russian people don't agree with the war anymore, the Russian president will have a big problem. Even Putin isn't immune from a coup. That being said, though, he has enough supporters for his war at the moment. According to the independent Levada Center Institute, 75% of Russians support Russia's military actions in Ukraine. But a leaked Kremlin report showed that this support was only at 25%. This 50% difference is a pretty big one. So we don't really know how many Russians actually support the war. And when you publicly say you're against the war, you can get arrested in Russia. It's hard to say how much support Putin actually has. If you want to predict how this looks in the future, well, good luck with that. But the 75% and 25% figures do show that Moscow's propaganda is at least bearing some fruit. If all Russians knew about the war crimes that Russia was committing in Ukraine, the numbers would hopefully be much lower. To keep support during the next year of the war, Putin has to continue running his propaganda machine. He has to censor news exposing the dark side of his so-called special military operation. And the Russian government has to continue framing the West as the bad guy. With NATO sending military aid to Ukraine, this becomes increasingly easy to do. Putin will say that this is clear-cut evidence of the West trying to destroy Russia.